Hello guys, welcome to Soul Fiction. So in this video, we will see, what if Naruto was Isekai'd into Overlord New World? If you enjoy these kinds of stories, don't forget to show us some love by hitting the like button and subscribing to the channel. Your support means the world to us. Now, let's start the story. Chapter 1. Wind with a Name. The wind remembered the market before the silence did. It came through South Rukongai a little after noon, all heat and saffron, snatching voices from stall to stall and turning them into ribbons of laughter and barter and gossip. Somewhere an apron snapped on a clothesline. Somewhere a toddler shrieked because his skewer had fallen into the dust. The wind snagged all of that, tugged at it, kept it moving. Then a boy shouted for his mother and made no sound. Lantern tassels flicked without a whisper. A cartwheel squealed in a pantomime the ear couldn't catch. Someone dropped a bunch of green onions. Their brittle clack happened with the aches of it and none of the noise. People looked at each other with their mouths starting to open and kept opening, and the world didn't answer. Naruto's shoulder. Ed threw a gap between a basket vendor and a fisherman and felt the silence hit his face like a cloth pressed tight to the mouth. The breeze around him dragged, then tried to stall. He lifted a hand, fingers splaying, and gathered a thin spinning layer of air against his palm the way a man might gather a sleeve, tightening until he felt the grit in the turn. "Easy," he said, and the wind heard him because the wind always did. He leaned down, scooped the silent toddler under one arm, and pointed with the other. The motion wasn't grand. It didn't need to be. The fisherman saw his finger and understood. "You, circle the cart. You. Take the old woman's elbow. You, stop trying to shout and use your hands, show people where to run." Naruto relocated the child behind his own leg and pointed. The boy blinked big eyes and obeyed, clutching the cloth of Naruto's hakama. When the first hollow slid through the fabric of the dead air, it came wrong. No roar, no rattle. Its mask was a smear of white set in a shape that refused focus. Like seeing a reflection in soup. The silence buckled around its mouth in an indentation that wanted to be a howl. Naruto didn't answer with a declaration. He tilted the wind against his palm until it hummed in his bones. Chakra had once been his life. This was not chakra, and yet it did what chakra always did when he asked. It came. "Okatsun," he said under his breath, with affection and humor and the slight impatience of a man in a market who'd rather not break the stalls. "Let's go." The blade arrived as twin arcs traced in the air without flash or flourish. They weren't steel so much as shaped pressure, wind that remembered edges, handles that formed when his hands wanted them. When he cut, the silence closed over the slash with no sound, but the hollow's mask still cracked. He stepped aside, nosing his body through gaps between baskets, turning his shoulders without touching anyone, the wind sutured to him like a tame animal. The hollow reached wide, mouth impossible. Naruto slipped under the grasp, sliced across the joint of the arm, 3 compact strokes, not even a show, and guided the boy behind him with a foot that never quite kicked. The mask split, fell in two, vanished like a cut thread, and the silence didn't change. He wouldn't win by counting corpses. The market didn't need a hero pose, it needed exits and no trampled children. Hane dropped into place beside him with a grunt he didn't hear, the tilt of her head the only indication she'd been running. Her black hair was tied up high and secure, her mouth dusted with flourware, from the look of her. Someone had shoved a rice cake at her on her way out of the barracks. She snapped her wrists and 3 thin paper talismans unfolded from her sleeves and stuck to the ground 3 paces apart. Square, sure and neat. Her lips shaped the words of a keto formula that the air swallowed. The sigils activated without a sound and lit like mothlight. Naruto felt their pull. They made a corridor no one could see, a line of least resistance along which running bodies would find it easier to move. He caught her eye and lifted his chin. She didn't nod. She didn't have to. Naruto sprang up onto the edge of a cart without dislodging a lemon, rolled his shoulder, and threw an invisible blade that was just a circle of pressure, tight and fast. It hit the lip of a tile awning and pinwheeled down. A bright spinning pressure that grabbed attention even in silence. He hooked 2 more circles, placed them in sightlines, and pointed, all the motion in the world concentrated on the simplest sentence he knew. There. And there. Go. The crowd moved. Hands grabbed hands. People dragged sacks the way you drag a friend who doesn't know they're in danger and will argue later. And with scarred knuckles hoisted, the toddler Naruto had abandoned and tucked him into the crook of his elbow, eyes pinned on Naruto's pointing finger. A second hollow poured itself out from between TWO market stalls, and a third peered up from under the planks as if the floor were water. Their masks were wrong too, not quite symmetrical, not quite secure, and the space they displaced didn't displace, it smoothed. Naruto kept his breath even. Panic wastes air. He cut the closer one at the knee and let it fall into the spin of his next attack rather than muscling it down. He didn't grandstand. Azane slid into view a heartbeat later. White coat flaring, hair pinned up tidy and already gone crooked. She'd picked a doorframe to be the door to a clinic. She dragged a table to become a bed. Her ND on a shoulder turned a wild-eyed butcher into a stretcher bearer, and Naruto thought, as he always did, that there were 100 ways to be strong and hers were all brutal and kind. He gave her a slice of pressure that carved a path through the press of bodies toward her new doorway. She glanced at him, mouth a thin line, and then she was rolling sleeves and setting bones without the comfort of her voice. A fourth hollow, bigger. Naruto breathed, crouched, and gathered. It wanted his attention. Good. He wanted its face. He stepped into the bite, blades crossing with no metal to clash, and let the wind anchor him. His left hand arc cut short to catch the hollow's attempt to fold him into itself. His right hand blade extended past where any blade should and came back along a curve only a storm knew. Kissing the edge of the mask at a place you wouldn't aim if you didn't know how masks tried to defend. He felt the give all the way in his elbows. Something caught at his ankle. He didn't look down. He released a body that wasn't his into the space his body had been. A promise given shape and skin. Stand there. Block the next blow. Don't move until she's clear. The clone stood, eyes brighter than people's. Nothing inside but that one intent. The hollow slammed into it and slowed, baffled. Naruto took the opening and used it without pity. The mask shattered like a thought broken. The clone looked at him, waiting for a next order it would never get, and vanished like breath off glass. Hane raised another sigil. She had chalk smeared across 3 fingers and a tiny cut at the EDG. Of her palm where paper had taught her it had edges. Her eyes were the color of old ice, not because she was cold, but because she had learned to think while other things were burning. She shifted a sigil half a pace with 2 knuckles. That was the difference between panic and flowing evacuation, between 12 people jamming themselves in a doorway and 12 people passing through it like a river. Another hollow manifested across the way, thin and tall, face too smooth. A boy threw a pot at it and the pot hit and didn't make a sound. The boy looked at his empty hand like someone had stolen his strength. Naruto reached back without turning and rapped the boy on the shoulder. The boy looked up at him. Naruto breathed out and smiled with his eyes and pointed the boy toward the clinic door. With 2 fingers and a twist. Go make yourself useful, help the healer. The boy ran. No words, no orders. A look and a gesture and a full breath and the world moved. By the time the silence thinned. No, not thinned. That wasn't right. By the time the wind remembered what the market had sounded like and insisted on it again, the hollow masks were dust, the halal butcher was helping Azane tie a tourniquet. And a woman with fast hands had begun to collect fallen scallions and lay them in tidy bunches, because order uses grief like a handle. The first sound wasn't a cheer. It was a hard swallow from a man who'd forgotten he had a throat. Then someone laughed too loud and someone started to cry and a child hiccuped. The world stumbled over its own noise and found it again. Naruto hopped down from the cart, found the toddler again and saw he'd been transferred from arm to arm 3 times and was now chewing on Azane's sleeve. He checked the boy's knee with 2 fingers. He lifted his hand, and the wind came to a rest along his wrist as if to ask, well. He set his palm against a stall post and released the leftover spin he was holding. The post thrummed once, like a plucked string. He patted it. Thanks, he murmured, and stepped away. Hane came to stand near him, her hands loose at her sides and chalk stripes faint against her skin. They both surveyed the market like carpenters who just braced a roof in a storm and were making sure it would stay up. He angled his head to her, question without words, you good? She lifted one eyebrow a clean millimeter. You. Naruto breathed the warm dust and changed the wind's mind about how it wanted to behave. It untangled from the corners it had gotten caught in, deck eaves and curtain hems and a girl's hair, and decided to be a breeze again. It carried a waft of frying oil, then cinnamon, then blood, then river water. The market was a market. It had survived. They watched Azane staple a new sign over the door she'd chosen for a clinic. It swung a little. Azane reached up and straightened it. The expression on her face said, "This is temporary, like everything, and we will treat it like a promise." Naruto touched the edge of his sleeveless haori with the heel of his hand. The white cloth hadn't had time to learn his shoulders yet. It still remembered the man who'd worn another like it before him. He sometimes wanted to apologize to it for being a different shape. "You looked satisfied with yourself at exactly one moment," Hane said, low, the words half stolen by the market's noise. "When was it?" When the boy ran to Azane without hesitating, Naruto said. "The rest is," he gestured, palm out, the movement a joke that didn't need a punchline. "Wind," she said. "And names," he said. They stood in the middle of a ring of people who had no idea they were standing in the middle of anything, and for half a minute neither of them moved, because stillness is sometimes the only way to check if you've finished without admitting how tired you are. A bell clanged at a distance and remembered how to be a bell. Naruto turned, testing the air with his shoulders the way a man tests river current, and nodded toward the seraite. Their day wasn't done. The courtyard was a plain patch of stone under a sky worn thin by afternoon. No banners, no seats, no rank. The captain commander liked to keep the part where he decided things unadorned. It made it easy to hear the decision when it landed. Shunsui Kyoraku stood with his arms folded into his sleeves and a hat that was not on his head for once. His eyes were narrowed in a way that would have looked lazy on any other man. It wasn't lazy. It was deliberate peace, and it made you want to deserve it. "Tell me her name," Shunsui said, the way a man asks for the time. "Only when she wants to be named," Naruto said. Shunsui sighed like a man who has been, reluctantly, young once. "All right, then," he said softly. "Make me hear her without saying it." Naruto looked down at the stone under his feet. A dry leaf had drifted into the courtyard and lay there as if it belonged. He rolled his neck, loosened wrists and ankles, then exhaled so the air inside him matched the air outside. He lifted a hand and did not draw a sword. He drew a circle with his finger in the space over the leaf and invited the breeze into a loop that would stay until he told it not to. A second circle at the outer edge. Opposite spin. The leaf twitched. Naruto tilted the circles a hair off true so that the air fell into them like a marble into a cup. The leaf rose and the leaf stayed because the wind argued with itself over who got to hold it. He drew 3 more circles, smaller, staggered in height, one of them barely more than the twitch of a fingertip. They caught falling cherry pita, ls and dust and the embarrassment of dry grass seeds. Suddenly the courtyard was a map. And the map was only real if you were the kind of person who believed that men could talk to weather and weather could make promises back. A breeze came, wanting to be a gust. Naruto led it. The circles thickened, held, stretched, sang against the fingers that had made them. He stepped through them like a man alking through strings stretched tight between doorposts, careful not to pluck too hard. He saw the moment the wind wanted to go greedy and shook his head once. It subsided, chastened. "Shikai," Shunsui said, soft. A question with a smile tucked in it. Naruto didn't answer with words. The blades were there, as they always were when he asked like that, not drawn from a sheath, but convinced that GE was a thing the world needed in this second. The left-hand blade dipped into one circle and came away singing the specific curve of that spin. The right-hand blade hit another and carried it like a bright bruise. He crossed them and they hummed to one another and turned the air between them into a promise that it would not let anything in that he did not allow. "Will you fight for it or with it?" Shunsui asked, not because he didn't know the answer but because a man should hear himself say it if he wants other people's lives to depend on it. "With," Naruto said. Shunsui scratched his cheek. "And will you save the man who tries to kill you if he starts to fall?" "Yes," Naruto said, and there was no virtue in the word. Just a simple truth, like saying that warm bread is better than stale. Shunsui glanced toward the far edge of the courtyard. A thin man stood there, the shape of a lieutenant with a face like someone had professionally removed his ability to look tired. His name wasn't important for this. He bowed once and then stepped forward with sword in hand. All right, Shunsui said. Let's show her to each other. Naruto didn't want to hurt the lieutenant. He also didn't want to be patronizing. He solved it by making it about the wind rather than the person holding the steel. They flowed together at a pace that respected the day's earlier work. The lieutenant's blade came with crisp intent. No feints for the sake of being pretty. Naruto parried without letting the blades ring. He let the wind take some of the force, not because he needed help, but because he liked how gentle strength felt. He broke the angle of the strike by a thumb's width, which is a magnitude few people train for. It makes most attacks miss without making their owners feel stupid. The lie. Udenant changed tactics and tried to set a rhythm Naruto would have to fall into. Naruto smiled because he had spent a lifetime refusing beats other people tried to hand him. He cut his own measure into the air, 1-2 and 1-2, and the wind learned it and kept it whether swords hit or missed. He chose a moment when the lieutenant overreached by half a breath and pivoted into his guard, and then. There wasn't any ground where the lieutenant had expected there to be ground because Naruto had asked the air to lift that patch of dust half an inch for half a second, just enough to adjust a stance. The lieutenant's foot slid. Naruto reached for the back of the man's collar and grabbed it before he fell. He held him in that simple humiliating balance where the body has to admit it isn't where it meant to be. Then set him back upright as if that had been the point all along. Shunsui laughed once, quick. That's enough, he said. His eyes had gone soft around the edges and sharp in the middle. You don't throw people when the ground is already doing it for you. Naruto dismissed the blades. The wind lingered, curious, then sighed out. He didn't speak his blade's true name. He didn't need to. Shunsui had heard it in the way the circles held and let go. Shunsui walked toward him, hands still tucked away. Up close, the captain commander looked like a man who had learned to be the adult I. And the room because someone had to do it and who privately missed being a younger brother. He reached up, fastidiously straightened Naruto's Haori collar 1 millimeter, and patted him once on the shoulder. We have a new division because we have a new problem, Shunsui said, conversational, like mentioning the weather. The walls between things have always leaked. Lately they've begun to fail with a kind of design that makes me suspicious. You know I don't love being suspicious. It gives me wrinkles. You wear them well, Naruto said, because the man had saved people with those wrinkles and jokes about hats. And because respect is better when it's not a performance. Shunsui colored a little and hid it with a cough. You'll take the 14th, he said. Naruto glanced down at the white cloth on his shoulders and then back up. I thought I had, he said. Now you have, Shunsui said, and his voice moved from friendly to final without getting louder. Boundary affairs. We would have edit 5 different pompous things if I let anyone else pick. Your headquarters is wherever the next tear opens. Your job is to see it quick and fix it fast and tell me what you learned if you have breath left for talking. Done, Naruto said. He meant exactly that. That he considered it already accomplished tomorrow and that the remaining steps were just getting from here to there. Shunsui put his hat back on like a curtain fund. And, Captain. One more thing. Naruto lifted his eyebrows. Try not to tear any walls yourself, Shunsui said, and smiled as he said it like a man who already knew exactly which walls Naruto would tear if pushed. Yoruichi was eating a rice ball on a wall like a cat in human clothes. She dangled her feet, her sandals making little scuffs against the stone. She didn't turn when Naruto came up, because of course she'd known he was there 2 breaths before he did. If the walls were people, which ones would you break first? She asked, not looking at him, mouth full. The ones standing in front of a door I needed, Naruto said. I'd try to leave the rest. She said, chewing. People who say, I'd try, are my favorite. Always room between the try and the do. He let the wind bring him the smell of the rice and nori. Yoruichi worked her jaw and then pointed the last bite at him like a judge's gavel. You're making friends with the captain commander's patience, she said. You should make friends with his tailor. I like the collar a little crooked, Naruto said. She snorted and kicked one heel. You'll get along with my division's washing line budget then. She slid him a glance with the humor set like a jewel and the appraisal under it honest. You were good in the market. You didn't try to be loud in the quiet. People were already scared, Naruto said. I didn't want my voice to make it worse by not being there. Yoruichi wiped a crumb from her lip with a forefinger and popped it. Central 46 will want you to explain what you are, she said in a different tone that had nothing of rice balls in it. They prefer nouns they can stab. Is captain not enough of a noun? He asked. For some, it will be, she said. For some, not even. Corpse would be enough. Naruto let the wind move hair at his temples and put no weight on the joke in his mouth because jokes are sometimes how you hold something steady. If they try to stab me, he said lightly, I'll try to use their momentum to save them time. Yoruichi smiled without showing her teeth. That line will either make Rukia like you more or less, she said. She's coming. Rukia came with formal steps, never fussy, and hands that wanted to be useful more than they wanted to be correct. She looked at Naruto the way you look at a new bridge, with relief that it's there. With suspicion about its anchor points, with a private thought about whether it will make your neighborhood better when people figure out how to use it. She bowed, not low and not shallow. Captain Uzumaki, she said. Rukia, he said. If you are set on being familiar, she said, a ghost of a smile tracking the words, you could at least mispronounce my name in a charming way. I would never, he said, and meant it in 2 languages. She held his eyes and then nodded once, like a deal struck. There's pressure, she said more quietly. Political. Central 46 do not like surprises, and you walk like one even when you are standing still. I can try walking like paperwork, Naruto said. Yoruichi made a coughing noise that was definitely a laugh. Rukia did not laugh. Rukia's gaze flicked to the captain commander's office. Back to Naruto. She kept her voice mild. Be careful in their rooms, she said. They don't always know where the doors are themselves, but they get angry when other people choose one. Noted, Naruto said. Do you have a door you want me to favor? She actually thought about it. The one with the least blood, she said. Failing that, the one that looks ugly now and safer later. We'll find it, Naruto said, and if we can't, I'll make one. Rukia's mouth tugged. It must be nice, she said. To speak like that and have your actions follow. It is, he said simply. It's also terrifying and exhausting and the thing that keeps me standing up when I'd rather sit down. Yoruichi popped to her feet with that unfair ease people call grace when it belongs to someone else. Try not to die, she said to both of them, as if it were a joke, which it wasn't. Try not to be late, Rukia said, which was not a joke either. They split. Yoruichi toward the shadows, and the rooftops and the places where she was most herself. Rukia toward the offices with their straight lines and straight-faced men. Naruto toward a barracks that had barely had time to learn his division's number. He found Hane at a desk that had known better days and was trying to be good on this one anyway. She had spread maps of the Rukongai wards with pins in scattered clusters that made sense if you knew how she thought. Kana Shiger from the 12th leaned over the maps with the posture of a cat at a fish stall who would never admit to begging. Kana's hair was an engineer's mistake on purpose. Strands caught under a hairpin she'd slapped there while running. She wore the 12th's uniform because someone had to, but had folded the left sleeve twice in defiance and practical comfort. Her expression said that if you argued with her about the sleeve, she would beat you with a calculus text. And so, she announced, without preamble or respect for anyone's rank, it isn't merely that sound drops. The vector field shows a collapse favoring inward spiral. Picture a sink drain. Now imagine it imposed on a district and a little hungry. Naruto put his knuckle on one of the pins and nudged it a thumb width. Kana glared at his knuckle like it was a senior officer. He took his knuckle away. What I would like, Captain, Kana continued in the voice of a person who has exceeded. Entirely acquired an authority they never asked for and must now use it responsibly, is permission to deploy a set of sigil recorders along this boundary so that the next time we feel the drain, we can see the pattern in the way it's braided, not just bleated about afterward. Bleeding is important, Hane said dryly. It lets people know where the sheep are. Kana tilted her head at Hane. I like you, she said, and meant it the way you mean it when you admit you admire a knife for being honest. Naruto touched the pins along the map's edge and then lifted his hand. Do it, he said to Kana. Use what you need without making enemies you can't outrun. That's more a life philosophy than a requisition policy, Kana said. Works for both, Naruto said. Hane slid her eyes toward him without raising her head. Central 46 sent a messenger, she said. No summons yet. A letter that says, soon, in as many words as possible without saying anything. Rukia sent a note with it. The note says, don't go alone. Noted, Naruto said, and meant he would go alone if he had to, and also that he knew what the warning actually meant. Not that he would be physically outnumbered, but that language has edges and you can cut a man with them if he doesn't have someone there to bandage the slice. They spent an hour marking. Naruto read the wind through the places on the map where no wind should be. The same way you read a person's mood through what they don't say. Hane made quiet corrections nobody argued with because when she corrected you, you felt relieved rather than embarrassed. Kana SWO, re softly at a piece of equipment that had decided it would only work if you were mean to it. She was very mean to it, and it obeyed. By late afternoon, Naruto's shoulders hurt in the way that came fr. Holding too much kindness in the same place as too much violence. He rolled them. Hane's eyes caught the motion and flicked to Azane, who had slipped in like a cool hand on a fever. Azane had a basket. You would think she had woven it herself from patience. She fished out 3 buns, handed one each to the people most likely to forget to eat, and kept one for herself. She leaned on the doorfra. Me she'd used earlier as a clinic and bit down with small, decisive teeth. I saw the quiet, she said around the bite. It had sharp corners. I like you too, Kana said, mouth full, and then looked scandalized at herself. As if she'd accidentally confessed affection and needed to revise the statement into a complaint. Hane ate with the patience of a woman who knows the battle you win with AF. All stomach matters more than the one you win with a dramatic speech. Naruto chewed and tasted pork and spice and a hint of something sweet. It reminded him of the market, alive and messy, and the first breath when sound came back. A runner's sandals slapped stone in the hall and then slowed out of respect. They knocked and then peered in as if the door itself had rank. Captain, they said, breathless. The wall. Naruto set the bun down. Kana tucked her equipment to her chest like a child, already moving without waiting for the rest of the sentence. Hane wiped her fingers with the back of her hand and was out the door on the 3rd syllable. The fracture at the Seraite's outer wall didn't look like a wound. It looked like the absence of one. Lanterns along the wall guttered in unison but didn't go out. The air tasted like the second after you grind chalk between forefinger and thumb. Naruto caught the wind as it tried to die and told it not yet. The blades answered with a hum like breath caught in the throat. Hane planted 2 sigils low and 1 high, fist striking stone like she was staking a tent in a gale. Kana slid along the wall with a device that had been 3 other devices earlier in the day. Slapping it at intervals only she understood. Azane rolled a kit open and put both hands flat on it, whispering against her own fingers, maybe prayer, maybe habit. A shape stepped out of the absence. It wore a mask that did not shine and clothes that would not be remembered even if you stared at them. Its sword was wrong. Naruto had seen swords. This wasn't one. It was an intention to separate, give an edge. 3 more shapes unfolded on either side of it, masks plain and eyes all lidless, white. They moved in like they thought they could make a corridor of erasure through him. Naruto did the least interesting thing possible. He stepped forward and kept stepping, blades low and tight, feet sure, and cut the front edge of their wrongness so it couldn't get traction. The first masked man fell back when his weapon slid through Naruto's promise and found less purchase than he thought. Naruto's left hand blade tapped the mask's cheek. It wasn't a killing blow. It was a notice. 2 more struck from either side. Hane's sigils flared, unsound bursting like light with no color. Their blades stuttered for a heart's half-beat. Naruto put his shoulder into the pause, heaved, and sent one of the masked figures skidding back along the wall. The stone underfoot tried to forget how to be stone. Naruto spent the regret like a coin and bought it another second of remembering. The fight didn't look like fights in storybooks. There was no overture. There was a rhythm of wrists, a series of steps that added up to corridors of air you could move through. Naruto didn't count opponents. He counted people he had to keep upright. Left, Hane said, the first word to make it out of her mouth into the wind's good graces. He trusted her mouth more than his eyes and angled without checking. A quiet blade hissed not at his gut but at the space where his name sat inside him. He felt it try to get in, not to end him, but to make the end not count. He misliked everything about it very much. He let the blade take a wisp of the wind he had set to guard the ground under his feet and replace it with air that smelled like the river, because river air knows how to deal with edges. It runs around them and turns them smooth. The blade hit water and lost pride. Naruto smiled with no teeth. The masked leader lifted a hand. The fracture breathed in. Lantern light tugged toward it like hair into a drain. Kana swore a word that probably existed only in the 12th syllab slang and slammed a palm against a brace sheet attached to the wall. It didn't stop the pull. It gave it a rhythm. And that makes everything easier to break. Now, Hane said, and Naruto said, under his breath and said to the wind, hold your breath for me, and then let his right hand blade go long as a whip. It traced the edge of the fracture not to close it but to define it, as if outlining the wrong shape would make it easier to persuade into the right shape later. The masked leader recognized too late that they were being measured for their own coffin and tried to interrupt. Naruto stepped into the interruption. He met the leader's wrong sword with both wind blades crossed and let the hum of the circles from the courtyard come back to his hands. He pivoted. The wrong blade stuttered along his edge and slipped. Naruto turned his shoulders as if to hug an old friend and deposited the leader into the same hug with the wall. The wall took the hit like a professional and gave nothing back. Hane shoved a final sigil hard into the fracture's left seam. Naruto reached past her shoulder, his wind climbing her chest like a sash, and smoothed the seam like hand smoothing paper. For a second he felt nothing. No air, no weight, no him, and then the fracture zipped shut like a mouth deciding it had said enough. The four masked figures flickered. One of them dropped an object that looked like a nail made from someone's name hammered thin. It clinked in a way that skipped around the ear. Naruto kicked it into Kana's waiting satchel with the gentle accuracy of a man good at making mischief in temples. Kana snapped the bag shut and hugged it to herself as if it were both precious and contagious. The leader made a motion with two fingers that said retreat and secrecy and failure in the same stroke, and then they were gone, the air flattening behind them. Naruto kept his blades U.P. for 3 breaths after it was over because over is a liar. Hane didn't relax until after he did, and then she did in a way that was half joke and half shaking out a hand that had cramped. Azane X hailed like one of her patients and began the after, which is the part you either do well or regret later. Kana had already started muttering to the satchel's contents in a tone that suggested if the nail tried to misbehave, she would ground it. Those masks didn't look like hollows, Azane said, wiping her hands with a cloth she would later throw away. They looked like men trying to be silence. They were, Hane said. They will make rules about you soon, Kana said to Naruto, distracted, eyes on the satchel. The sort that have names longer than the people writing them. I don't mind rules about me, Naruto said. I mind rules that get people killed. Kana said absently. Try saying that to the men who think rules are what keep their chairs upright. Someone should remind them the floor keeps their chairs upright. Hane murmured. Naruto knocked the wall once with his knuckles, a light, friendly tap. Thank you, he said, and meant the wall and meant the wind and meant tea. He people who had held lines he'd indicated with 2 fingers and no sound. He glanced toward the lanterns. Their light was back to being the modest sort that do their job without bragging. Kana fish. D out the nail with a pair of tongs too small for the job and waggled it in the air. It was black, not the absence of color black, but the kind you get when you burn wood and rub the residue between finger and thumb. It marked what it touched. It had 3 characters stamped near the head. Hane leaned in, eyes slitting, then widened one of them a fraction. The central seal, she said. But altered. Kana snorted. Altered, Captain. That's a forgery so petty it's almost art. Someone took a stroke off an official sigil and hoped nobody who wasn't in the 12th would notice. Some of us in the 13th would notice. Rukia said from behind them. She had arrived without fanfare and stood with her hands tucked once more into appropriate places. Her eyes tracked the nail with the careful hatred of a person who knows what it would do in a throat. Naruto looked down at the characters. He wasn't a scholar, but he knew a name when he saw one bent into an unname. He turned the nail with 2 fingers. The characters didn't like being looked at. Good. He wouldn't let that stop him. We'll need proof more formal than a nail, Rukia said. Kana made a noise that sounded a lot like laughter after you iron it. I'll get you your proof, Lady Kuchiki, she said without bowing. But I'd rather nail it to someone's front door. Start with their conscience, Azane said mildly. It will hurt more. Hane repacked her talismans with the same care she'd planted them, her movements clean and unhurried. Naruto watched her fix a torn edge with a small brush and paste from a bottle she'd pulled out of a sleeve. He had once thought he knew all the ways to fight. He kept learning. That was the mercy of it. That was the cost. They walked back along the wall in a loose constellation. People nodded to them and didn't. You could always tell who had been close to a thing by how quickly they wanted to be far from it. Naruto let them have their distance. He couldn't give them their voices back. If the wind hadn't already decided to return them, and he wouldn't pretend otherwise. At the barracks, Rukia pulled him aside with a look. They stood in the narrow space between two buildings where WIND gets funneled and a whisper can be enough to move a city. You'll be called before them, she said. If not tonight, then soon. They'll ask your blade's name. Don't give it to people who would use it to unmake you. I wasn't going to, he said. They will ask what you are, she said. The men with seals will, and the men with swords will watch to see how you answer so they can decide whether to cut with you or at you. How would you answer? He asked. Rukia's face did a thing you don't get taught. It softened along the jaw and stiffened around the eyes and made a place for a lie she didn't want to tell but might have to. I'd say, a man who saves children, she said. I'd say, a captain who keeps his promises. I'd say, the wind with a name. That last one is too flattering, he said. That last one is what I will say if they try to take your Haori, she said. Then, quieter, be careful with your Bankai. He looked at her. You haven't seen it, he said. No, she said, but I saw the way the air hurt when you pressed it against the fracture. I know what a thing can do by the shadow it leaves behind when it isn't doing it. He inclined his head, serious. Thank you, he said. He didn't promise anything. Promises had power around his blade. He didn't make them unless he meant to carve them into the wind. Rukia nodded once and left with the pace of a woman who had much to do and time to do exactly most of it. Hane waited by the door. She had a new chalk line across one knuckle. You juggle people, she observed when he came close, like knives. I try to keep the edges pointed at things that deserve it. He said. You will cut yourself, she said. Not a threat, not a pitying prediction, a simple geometry. I know, he said. I've done worse. She stood with him a moment longer, as if measuring the distance between his shoulders and the door and deciding if she wanted to stand in his way. You could let someone hold a knife with you, she said finally, almost offhand, but not. He laughed under his breath. I'm still learning to let people carry plates around me without grabbing them in case they drop. I've noticed, she said. It's annoying. Duly noted, Lieutenant, he said, and gave her an angle of a bow that implied apology and respect and a small intent to continue being annoying in ways that saved lives. She rolled her eyes in a motion so small you could miss it if you weren't looking for the smile that accompanied it. There's work, she said. There always is, he said. They went back inside. Kana had spread the nail's image across paper B. Why some press whose mechanics he decided not to ask about yet. The newer version bore the altered stroke. The older version sat beside it like a good child. The difference was almost nothing. It made rage slip cold down his spine. Azane set tea down near his elbow and he took it without looking. The first sip burned his tongue. He didn't protest. Pain tells you you're still here. He needed that. GHT ran its fingers over the barracks and didn't turn out all the lanterns because even darkness has manners in places where healers work. Naruto finished the tea and set the empty cup down with care. He leaned over the map again and breathed. The wind came to him like dogs do when you sit on the ground with a slice of bread and good intentions. Division 14, he said without standing straighter, without raising his voice. Without anything boastful, he simply said it so that it would have a place to sit. Boundary affairs. He let the name be real by being said. We keep people from vanishing. Hane's pen paused, then moved again, writing the line in the margin as if it were a list of supplies. Azane smiled at the paper in a way no one would see unless they were watching her instead of what she was doing with her competent hands. Kana flicked a switch on her press with a gentleness she had not afforded it earlier. The wind tugged at the corner of the map. Naruto pressed it down with the back of his hand. Outside, the city exhaled. Above, somewhere far beyond the walls, a sky no one could see right now held onto stars that would come when they were supposed to. He allowed himself the thought that he could sleep. Later, if the night allowed it. He picked up his haori with one hand, shook out the cloth, and hung it on the peg by the door. The white caught what little light remained and made it bearable. The wind ran its invisible hands along the fabric as if checking the stitching. Stay, Naruto told it, and didn't mean the cloth. The wind stilled obediently at the threshold, like a guard with nothing to do except wait for orders and listen for what breaks. It had been a good day, if you defined good as, we lost less than we might have. He did. He always had. He lid the paper with the sigil toward himself again and memorized the missing stroke, the not quite nothing that was the shape of the trouble. He said nothing. He didn't have to. The wind was listening, and trouble had a name even when men tried to cut letters out of it. In the morning, he'd go to the wall again and look like a man looking at stones. In the afternoon, he'd let Central 46 ask him questions designed to find edges. In the evening, he might have to fight in the places where fights didn't belong. Between those times, he would keep the promise he'd just spoken aloud and the wind would enforce it because that is what language can do when it's not being used as a weapon against itself. For now, he leaned both hands on the desk and let his eyes slide closed for the length of a single, unguarded breath. He pictured the child in the market asleep with a piece of Azane's sleeve still damp from his mouth. He pictured the man who had carried him there telling someone at home a story with sounds in it. He pictured the leaf in the courtyard, held in the balance between circles, not falling because someone had asked the world not to make it fall yet. Tomorrow, he said to no one and to the wind and to the empty doorway. The wind, good soldier that it was, did not answer. It only waited. Chapter 1 End. Chapter 2. The rooftops know our names. Karakura at dusk wore the kind of light that makes rooftops feel closer together than they are. Heat stalled in the alleys. Laundry lines lifted lazy palms to a breeze that hadn't decided who it loved more, the river or the ramen stand. Up on the tiles everything smelled like broth, soap, and evening. Yoruichi ran as if the rooftops bowed under her feet to make the strides neater. She didn't look back. She didn't have to. Naruto was there because the wind never left her alone when it meant to be mischief. There, she said without pointing, so he looked where her chin might have tilted if she had bothered. A figure in gray moved 3 roofs ahead, never kicking a single tile. Even their weight seemed courteous. The sort of careful that only comes from training or guilt. Naruto let the wind put a hand on his back. He didn't sprint. He lengthened. Tiles didn't rattle. A stray cat lifting its head near a vent barely took notice. The runner cut left and then did a thing no normal feet would, stepped into shadow off the edge. And came out on a different roofline like the alley was a river you could cross at a sandbar only you knew. Pretty, Yoruichi said. I'll kiss you on the cheek if you don't break the fishmonger's sign this time. I would never, Naruto said, judged the distance, and shifted the current a hair so a drooping banner lifted at the right second. He hit it with one foot, used the give, slid to the next roof without even worrying the rope. The runner glanced back then. Their mask wasn't a hollow's. It was the kind a person wears when they want to be seen as nobody in particular. Even their eyes were an average color, which is its own art. They tossed something backward, small as a spitball. It hit the tile between Naruto and Yoruichi and made a circle of dead sound the size of a hat brim. Kai skimmed the edge and used it as a step because of course she did. Naruto planted his foot on the dead patch, took the lack of music like a dare, and let his heel whisper a little gust into it. The deadness didn't like being told it was air after all. It sulked and turned back into normal sky. Naruto felt the set of the runner's shoulders change. Whoever they were, they didn't like improv. The chase turned conversational. Yoruichi didn't slow. You think this one's Ashen Covenant? They don't love us, Naruto said. Flirting would be more fun, Yoruichi said, and then cut right so hard at. Elevision Antenna shivered and decided to forgive her. They ran along a ridge where Karakura fell away on either side into the kind of streets where stories happen whether you want them to or not. The runner vaulted a narrow alley and never touched the far wall. Naruto heard, didn't hear, the faintest wrongness. The air under the runner's foot didn't compress like it should have. It had been coaxed to forget it could. Technique, he said under his breath. Cheap trick, Yoruichi said. Watch your rhythm. They came to a flat stretch. The runner accelerated, then turned sudden nothing and dropped out of sight. Yoruichi didn't miss a step. She launched herself into the gap with the serene confidence of someone who expects the world to provide stepping stones because she asked nicely and stole most of the good ones last time. Naruto followed and found a kind of staircase drawn in shadow, platforms that weren't, laid along the side of a building that had no business owning them. He stepped on one and felt the air's offense. He apologized with a shape of wrist and flow of breath, and the step held long enough for a body that knew how to listen to pass. The runner took the last 3 in a B. Lure and landed in an alley that had decided to be wider than it was. They were good. Not Yoruichi good. Not yet. Where did they break for handoff? Yoruichi asked, and answered herself, Riverside. He runner hit pavement and moved human again, which meant fast and clumsy at once. Naruto dropped to street level, let a cyclist wash past him in a bell ring of surprise, and then cut off the end of T. He alley by closing a door the wind hadn't realized was a door until he asked it to be one. The runner bounced off the invisible current and stumbled 3 steps. Yoruichi was already there to introduce them to a wall. She didn't punch. She caught their wrist where the pulse was and pinned them with 2 fingers and the thread of more. You're losing your touch, she told Naruto mildly. I'm trying not to break the fishmonger's sign. He said. Ah, she said, amused, and peeled the runner's hand open with the care of someone unwrapping a candy with mean wax paper. A black nail lay in the palm. It looked like nothing until you saw the way the light around it decided to go home early. Don't, the runner said, and their voice sounded like Karakura, like any shopkeeper, any clerk. That bothered Naruto more than if they had hissed. He took the nail with a hand he'd sand scraped in another life. It stained his skin black where it touched, characters impressed by pressure, not ink. Yoruichi made a noise. Where's the cash? Naruto asked the runner. They clamped their mouths shut like a child daring you to notice a cookie missing. Up, Yoruichi said, and flicked her eyes at the fire escape. 2 turns, dry or vent. You want the clever or the quiet? You take clever, Naruto said. I'll take quiet. He wasn't sure who felt the joke more sharply, them or him. The cash sat where Yoruichi had said it would, of course. A program of nails in a cloth roll, stamped with different names. Not people's, not yet. Words like Koya, Yamabuki, Sadao, common enough, you could hurt a neighborhood with just those. Never mind the talismans tucked underneath, each a tiny, neat seal that looked like any of 100 official seal descendants, until you looked long enough to remember what the true one looked like. A stroke missing, a line too smooth. Naruto held one up and felt the way it wanted to eat what people called each other. The edge of him didn't forgive the impulse. They walked the runner back out under streetlights, finding their courage. He wasn't here to break bones. He was here to stop the bleeding. Yoruichi's grip on the runner's wrist remained gentle in a way that wasn't soft. The runner breathed faster, looked at the nail in Naruto's hand as if it were a lover and a snake, and then looked away. What do they do with them? Naruto asked. Pin names to paper, Yoruichi said. Bleed them until they curl. Less mess than blood, more lasting. And if you pull the nail out, depends how long it's been there. She gestured at the nail. That's a courier load. Fresh. You found them before dinner. Lucky. Naruto glanced down the street. A man stood at a corner, one hand in another's, laughing. When he said the other's name, the sound carried and stayed. Naruto made a small private vow without letting it harden into a promise yet. His blade loved promises. He had to feed it carefully. They left the runner bound with rope that would let them go if they decided to be brave in the right direction. Yoruichi could tie a knot that made you consider your life choices. They moved along the river's edge. The water was trying to hold the sunset. The current tugged it along anyway. 2 blocks down, Azane's makeshift clinic had sprouted in the shell of a laundromat that had closed early for reasons everyone understood and none of them liked. People sat on chairs that had been machines and pressed damp hope in their palms like towels. A woman clutched at Azane's sleeve. Her lips were already forming a name. Azane said nothing, just set her hand over the woman's finge. RS and carried the syllables to Naruto with her eyes. He came close and the smell of detergent cut through everything else. On the floor sat a small boy with a band-aid slapped proudly on one knee. He was bravely not crying. He held a paper with an awkward drawing of a fish and a scribble at the top where a name had been started and then forgotten and started again and then changed into shapes because the letters wouldn't come. "Say it," the woman whispered. "Please, just say it." She didn't mean his name. She meant the boy's. He deserved to hear it. Naruto crouched on his heels and kept his blades sleeping. Because some things required empty hands. The nail in his palm touched his skin again and the characters there warmed with a meanness that assumed it was inevitable. He looked at the boy. The boy looked at him. The room decided it would be quiet for a moment so something important could happen. "Hey," Naruto said softly. "You dropped this." He reached up into the space between Voic's and wind and took hold of the shape that a name makes in a house. It isn't just sound, it's where you place the cup, what you say when you stub a toe, the direction a head tilts from the pillow when called. He found it because the boy's mother had built it every morning since he was born. He set it back where it belonged, gently, like returning a coin to a shrine you hadn't meant to take. "Kenji," Naruto said. The boy's eyes went so wide the world might have fit in them. His mother fell onto her knees like her bones had new maps. She said it too, quietly at first and then with a sob that let air back into her. "Kenji," she said, and pulled him into her arms and said it again, because saying it is a kind of holding. Azane's hands lost their tremor. She set a palm on the back of the mother's head for one breath and then peeled herself back to be useful somewhere else. Yoruichi leaned on the counter and watched without making it about herself. Naruto stood and felt older and almost fine. "Name nails," Kana said from the door like a swear and a diagnosis. She'd arrived at a run, satchel slapping her hip, hairpin barely holding. "Have you kept your fingers off the business ends?" "Of course not." She plucked the nail from Naruto's hand with tweezers she had definitely invented from a fork. She held it up to the fluorescent light, sneered at it the way a mathematician sneers at a PR. "Oof, that can't decide if it's clever or cruel. They pin them down," she muttered. "Bleed them into docility. Leave just enough to call someone for soup and bedtime and not enough to call them back from a ledge." She dropped it into a glass vial with a prim little click. "I'll need samples from unstolen names for a baseline." "No," Azane said, not looking up from a wrist she was taping. "No one is donating their name to science today. I'll take syllables," Kana sighed. "Fine, half a syllable. Take mine," Naruto said. Kana squinted at him in suspicion. "You don't have half syllables," she said. "You have entire mouthfuls. Take some anyway," he said, and hummed a fragment of his own name under his breath. The vial's surface quivered. Kana looked up, surprised in a way she hid by being rude. "Interesting," she said. "You're loud." "Blame the wind," Naruto said. Kana corked the vial, stuffed it away, and pointed at the nail roll under Yoruichi's arm. "We'll burn these properly," she said. "With witness." "With joy," Yoruichi said. They stayed until the laundromat clinic could be a laundromat again and the boy with the band-aid had drawn a second fish, this time with a name at the top that would stay. When they left, the river had given up on keeping the sunset and settled for moonlight instead. Hueco Mundo's desert had a way of convincing you you'd always been in it. Dunes did not shift because of wind or time, they did it to erase footprints. Naruto and Hane walked across a white that had devoured its own color. The world made no sound. Even the sand underfoot refused to rasp. When he breathed, the air entered like a lesson in humility. They'd brought chalk. Hane had told him, "We talk in lines," and handed him a stub. He wrote north on a stone and the word sat there looking embarrassed. Then steadied. Hane sketched a grid the size of a table across a flat patch of rock and then drew a bend in the grid's edge like a river in miniature. Naruto nodded. The bend meant retreat path. He lifted a hand to test for hollows and found nothing because nothing here took tests. The edge of sight offered shapes that didn't exist when you looked at them. It was like trying to remember a name after a bad dream. Hane came up beside him and pressed their wrists together, just a touch, skin to skin. The chalk line to him traveled through the contact like chow. Dust always wants to whoever makes more of it. He didn't ask if she was afraid. He liked fear. It had kept him honest when he was younger, and a worse idea seemed like a better one. They moved. He kept his blade uncalled. Because he'd learned from the market that drama fed the wrong kind of hunger. When the first null hollow approached, it did so in a polite arc, a shadow that decided to be a mask when it was tired of being a shadow. Its eyes were not eyes. They were polite holes. Naruto didn't say howl. He asked the wind to exist around his fingers. It was hard. The silence pressed his request flat. He told it a story it liked better. A boy in a market, the sound of a bell learning itself again. The wind came, reluctant and then grateful. He struck and felt nothing, which scared him more than pain. The blade cut shape into shape. The hollow's mask cracked without screaming and blew away as grit. He didn't look satisfied. Hane's chalk line extended along the rock, steadying him. 2 more blanks approached, shy as cats that intend to bite you. Naruto didn't chase. He held his ground and let the desert come. The trick with quiet is not to try to shout it down. It is to Isekai'd decide you are part of its version of normal. They fought like that for a while, long enough that when the wind finally admitted its own name again he could taste salt in his mouth from sweat he hadn't noticed starting. They reached a ridge that wasn't. It had the posture of a ridge, the mood of a doorway. Hane tapped chalk to her palm. 4 short strokes, 1 long, and then drew a tight spiral that looked like a curl of hair. Naruto smiled because he knew what that meant on her maps. Home. He nodded. They turned back. Halfway, a shape that was not desert moved with elegance that betrayed training. Naruto slid between shadow and line and cut. The blade skated over something that was not hollow. The figure blurred and then steadied, skulking away with the indignant dignity of a thief who had intended to take only fruit and found themselves in a jewel box. They didn't attack again. They had been measuring, not killing. Hane sketched a quick square on the rock and shaded it. Watched. He penciled an arrow pointing the direction their observer had taken. Later, the return to the threshold between Hueco Mundo and Seraite felt like the kind of relief you don't trust. The last 50 paces were the worst. A silence pooled underfoot like water. You could drown in that if you didn't respect it. Naruto did. He made himself small inside, not because he was afraid, but because it lets you fit through narrower places. At the barrier Hane erased home from her map with a firm hand and drew it again 2 inches to the right. They will expect us to come out where we went in, she mouthed. And he nodded and let the wind carry her cautious thought as if it had always been his idea. When they stepped into the courtyard of clear swords, the air tasted like steel and pine needles and argument. The inquiry room wasn't a courtroom because Central 46 didn't admit to liking theater. They preferred theater that insisted it was merely an office. The elderly men sitting where the Rue made them tallest wore faces with expressions sold under the label civic disappointment. The younger ones wore faces someone had ironed. Naruto stood with his hands visible. He wasn't going to twitch. He was going to be a weather system slowly reorganizing furniture. Captain Uzumaki, the central voice said, aging silk. You've come into unique circumstances. I've walked into worse rooms, Naruto said. He meant cellars full of bad choices and children who shouldn't have had to make them. You are divinity tainted. The silk liked this phrase. It expected him to bite. I'm wind tainted, Naruto said pleasantly. And soup tainted. I had ramen on the way here. A younger man leaned forward, hungry around the eyes. Do you consider yourself loyal to the Central 46? I consider myself loyal to the people who keep the world from falling apart, Naruto said. Sometimes those are you. Sometimes those are bakers and healers. A rustle moved the old robes. Someone disliked bakers. A paper shivered. We have concerns about your bankai, another said. The reports suggest damage to nomenclature. Naruto waited. The word hung there, proud of itself. He didn't feed it. We'd like a demonstration, the silk said, as if asking for a cup of tea. Something small. An assurance. Rukia coughed in the doorway. Not a real cough. A line tossed. There are regulations regarding release in administrative chambers, she said. Eyes demure, stance fearless. Interference with seals. The hazard to records. Clause 11. Sub. Thank you, Lieutenant Kuchiki, one of the iron faces said through teeth that wanted to grind. We are aware of the clauses. Of course, Rukia said. I apologize. I worry about paperwork. She didn't apologize. She liked the weaponry of words too much to bow to it unless it earned it. Kana lurked against a side wall, the expression on her face a postcard from annoyed genius. She lifted a finger as if asking to speak in class and didn't wait to be called. If you want a demonstration, I can provide one, she said. Of forgery. The nails and prints hit the table with crisp little sounds. Kana had stamped the official seal alongside the altered one, and then written in neat letters a list of 10 things the altered seal could not do if examined with a conscience. She tapped the missing stroke with the kind of finger that has never known how to be patient. A murmur. One of the older men took a breath that turned into a swallow. Another leaned over the paper and blinked like someone looking in a mirror that refuses to flatter. The silk rolled phrase divinity tainted in his mouth again like candy that had gone stale. These allegations of forgery are serious, he said. But they are not proofs. They are enough to keep me from demonstrating a weapon you don't understand in a room where the records will not survive it, Naruto said, mild. I'm sure you understand my concern for your paperwork. Yoruichi snorted somewhere near the ceiling. We can bind you for noncompliance. A younger one said, almost too eager. 4. Contamination, another supplied. Naruto folded his hands behind his back to keep from touching the air like AM. And checking the pockets of a bully's coat for stolen coins. You can try, he said. He didn't change tone. He didn't posture. He didn't gather wind. The room felt the change anyway. Because some men ache whether by breathing and not because they are special, but because they have chosen to be the kind of open window other people can live near. Rukia stepped half a pace closer. Not in front of him. Beside him, where a friend stands who knows their own weight. Azane had entered without shoes making a sound. She stood at the back with her hands tucked and her eyes not blinking. Kana's shoulders squared in a direction that meant she would start throwing inventions soon. A rustle of other uniforms. Too many to count without making it look like counting mattered. Some of the seated officers, thirds, fourths, not just lieutenants, came to the doorway and didn't leave. The inquiry had become a room with witnesses the moment the men in it forgot that rooms with doors have other doors. Naruto met the Silk's eyes and said something that wasn't a speech. I will keep working, he said. With your stamp, without it. With your help, preferably. If you come for me, do it because I failed my job, not because you're afraid I might be good at it. The Silk looked at him like looking at a storm over wheat. You are arrogant, confident, Naruto said. Tired, hungry, and right. Shunsui's presence touched the doorway then, not body, but a permission. One word from him could have settled it like dust. He didn't give the word. He let Naruto own what he'd just said. The inquiry ended not because NY1 banged a gavel but because there was nothing left to ask that would have given anyone more than they'd just gotten. The men with seals gathered up their softer words like robes and left. The Inger one who'd wanted bindings looked at Naruto like a man measuring knives and deciding which one would hurt him more to use. He found none he liked and followed his elders. Rukia watched them go with the kind of stillness that makes poets nervous. Kana bumped Naruto's elbow with the folder when no one was looking and murmured, "Data charm," without moving her lips. He palmed it. It was small, wrapped in oil paper, humming faintly. Secrets you could plant like seeds. He didn't thank her. He didn't have to. She knew gratitude in the way his fingers didn't tighten on the paper like it was the only rope on a cliff. On the steps outside, officers Naruto had only nodded to before this day stood like citizens discovering they live on the same street. A few dipped their heads. A man with hair like a horse's mane and a scar down his jaw did the small, old-fashioned gesture of placing 2 fingers over his heart and then away. Naruto did not own that. He refused to. He let it belong to them. They dispersed. Work waits for no one's pride. Evening in Seraite makes rooftops quieter than Karakura's. The tiles here are older, and the air knows more names it refuses to say unless asked politely. Naruto took the long path. The one without watchers. You learn those faster than you intend to when you carry a Haori. Hane was already on the edge of a high roof, legs drawn up, arms looped round them, more practical than pensive. She was not the sort of woman you catch staring off at a horizon without a reason. She handed him a persimmon when he sat. He didn't ask where she'd gotten it. He, bitten the fruit, told him late summer would happen whether they lived through it or not. He held the piece of his name he'd hummed for Kana on his tongue like a foreign candy. It felt fine there. It would feel worse later. He decided not to make a promise about it tonight. You were loud for a man who didn't raise his voice, Hane said. You feel it more when walls are listening, he said. They were, she said. She picked a thread off her sleeve and rolled it between finger and thumb until it made a neat little ball and then let the wind take it. It floated away like a baby kite and then set down 3 tiles over like a grounded thought. You were good in the desert, he said. I was fine, she said. Then, quietly, as if adjusting a talisman on a door, I do not like the kind of quiet that tries to decide me. Me either. He didn't say I was afraid when I couldn't hear you. She didn't say I watched your mouth and thought of the way names look when they're about to fall. I'm not afraid of dying, she said. A minute later, and the way she said it made it true but not brave. I am afraid of being forgotten while still breathing. I am afraid of waking up with an empty space where. Mine wasn't being told I'm easier this way. He turned the persimmon stem in his fingers. The wind came up the side of the roof like a friend who has learned to ask before hugging. Hane, he said, and said it like he'd decided to carry the weight of it with him whether it slowed him down or not. He didn't make a vow because he didn't want his blade to get drunk on it. He made something smaller and more stubborn. I won't let that happen, he said. You can't promise that, she said, not accusing, simply correcting a boy's math with a woman's ledger. I'm not promising, he said. I'm informing the world of my intent. She made a sound not unlike a laugh choking on its tea. You are exhausting. I know, he said. I'm trying to be better about it. She leaned back on her hands, stretched her ankles, cracked one knee with a neat little pop. The moon cut along the line of her jaw like a tailor measuring cloth. Rukia will have to decide how much of you she is willing to be seen agreeing with, she said. She already has, Naruto said. Azane will take your pulse when you're sleeping and deny it if asked. She will, he said. Kana will pretend to hate you and then invent 6D. Vices that only work if you're the one holding them. She has, he said, and smiled. Hane tilted her head toward him without looking. And me, you'll draw the lines, he said. And erase them and I keep trying to walk through walls that should stand. She sat with that, like a stone warming in the last light. I don't want them to make you choose between being captain and being wind, she said. They can try, he said. You'll try to choose both and hurt yourself where no one can bandage it, she said, irritation under the mercy. He put the persimmon stem on the tile between them. The wind failed to move it because it had been told to leave certain small things alone. If I have to choose, he said, I'll choose people. Not your Haori, she said, watching the stem. It's only cloth until it's not, he said. And if it stops being what it's supposed to be, I'll hang it up somewhere and take it down when it remembers. She glanced at him then, quick as a sparrow and about as judging. I wish you wouldn't talk good when what you mean is dangerous. I can try, he said. She snorted. There it is again. Try. You like that word, he said. It leaves space, she said. For me. For you to disappoint me without breaking anything I can't replace. She stood then, fluid and exact, brushing dust off her palms for something to do. We have early. Kana wants to place recorders on wards 7 through 9 before the dawn cooks the air. She's bossy, he said. She's right, Hane said. And she likes you. She likes my utility, he said. Hane's mouth tilted. Same thing. They went down a narrower path than they'd taken up. He kept a step behind her so if she slipped he could be a stupid instinct with arms. She didn't slip. He still enjoyed the posture of being useful to someone who didn't require him. At the barracks door, she turned like she was going to say something else, then didn't. He didn't make the silence fill in for her. He opened the door and let it wing wide, and held it without making a production of holding it. She went through and let her shoulder brush his, not because she needed to be steadied, but because sometimes you tell the person best. You know they're there without saying it aloud. Inside, the map waited. The pins glowed faintly where the oil in them caught the lantern light. The wind had stayed where he'd told it, which Alwa YS felt like a small miracle even when he knew the mechanics. Naruto checked the data charm with 2 fingers and slid it into a hollow under the desk he hadn't shown anyone else yet. He had learned the kind of secrecy that isn't a lie. Just a spare key you don't tell people about until they need the house. He pulled his haori off its peg and folded it. He put it down flat, palms smoothing the cloth once, twice. Not because it mattered to the cloth but because his hands needed a thing to make orderly. He thought of Kenji, and the persimmon, and the boy on the rooftop who had probably fallen asleep by now without remembering why he felt safer on this particular night. Tomorrow, Hane said from the other side of the room. Tomorrow, he said. The wind at the threshold did not move. Waiting is a kind of work. They were all good at it. Chapter 2 End. Chapter 3. Edges that cut too deep. By noon the heat over Ward 10 had turned every rooftop into a kiln. Banners hung tired. Linen dried too fast and carried dust instead of soap. It was a bad hour for a fight because people were caught between chores and lunch and would run with their hands full. Naruto felt the change 6 streets away. Wind stumbled over an absence and came up short like a dog at an invisible fence. He turned his palm and the air pooled against his skin, thin, resistant, too still. Hane glanced up from her notes without needing to ask. Azane had a basket on her arm and didn't bother pretending it was for shopping. She had rolled bandages on top and calm under that. They rounded a corner, and quiet hit them. Not the reverent kind, the mean kind. Faces blurred at the edges first. Not gone. Just the way a drawing looks before an artist commits. Children clapped games into their palms and failed to make a sound. A woman tried to call through an open window and got an ache between her ribs instead of her husband's name. Naruto lifted a hand. No flourish, and the wind obeyed, low around ankles and doors, nudging bodies toward open lanes. Evac, Hane said, already snapping talismans from her sleeves. She planted the first 2, then changed her mind, ripped one up and reset it a foot to the left. The cord, she-shaped bent like a river wants to bend when the land is kind. Azane turned the step of a public bathhouse into a triage bench with a look and a knuckle. Her hands moved like truth. You could dislike it, but it would still be true. She took a girl's wrist and mouthed breathe at her until the girl remembered how. The first null hollow pushed through a wall as if the boards had never had opinions. It was tall and wrong. A silhouette that wanted to be a mask and hated the work. Naruto didn't call. He let the wind define edges around his fingers and met the thing with 2 clean strokes that didn't waste anyone's time. The mask cracked, not loudly, and blew away as grit. 2 more, then 6, then too many, moving in from the alleys where the sun didn't reach. Naruto didn't try to control the whole field. He drew lines. Hold here, clear there. Promise clones popped from the air with single-purpose minds. Catch the falling basket, block that swing, stand in this doorway until they pass. Each one looked to him for a second, took a breath it didn't need, and went to work. Rukia arrived without ceremony and turned the street into a series of thin ice channels that looked decorative until you realized how they guided feet. People slid along them like a festival game. She didn't look at Naruto, she didn't need to. They were 2 carpenters on the same roof, bracing different beams. A building groaned, not loud, just a visible shiver in wood. Naruto stepped under the overhang and pushed air up with both hands like a man lifting a table. The tenement settled. A little boy under it reacted, head out instinctively and set his palm against the air as if it were a wall that would keep being there if he believed hard enough. Naruto grinned at him and kept it steady. That was when the Covenant sent their blade. Lightning came first. Not sky lightning, temperament lightning. Takemikazuki stepped out of silence with a courtesy that irritated Naruto more than arrogance would have. He wore a ask without ornament and a sword that looked like steel until you looked at it too long and realized it was law. Captain, he said, voice smooth enough to cut a throat without leaving a stain. It wasn't loud. Everyone heard it anyway. Busy, Naruto said. Takemikazuki looked past him at the street as if counting and finding a number he didn't like. Collateral damage, he observed, and tilted his head. Preventable. Naruto didn't answer. He put his back to the tenement and kept it up with a measured push of air. His blades came into his hands without pronouncement. Hane's chalk met stone at his boot. 4 quick lines. Duelist. Fast. No sound. Don't chase. He didn't smile. He wanted to. Takemikazuki moved. The first exchange didn't bother with testing. He came in like a clean decision. Straight through the empty space between one breath and the next, and aimed at Naruto's center, not to kill, but to shift him away from the collapsing roof. Naruto refused to move. He took the strike na blade that wasn't there until it needed to be. He felt the knot steel bite against wind and tried to unmake it. He added river to the air, slip and persistence, and the bite lost purchase. They traded. Placements across the laundry lines strung between buildings. Takemikazuki's feet never tangled. He ran along a taut string like a man who had paid the balance in advance. Naruto vaulted, flipped heat over both their heads so the alley turned into a white room for a second, and used the bright cloth to hide a promised clone, trip him at the knee on 3. On 3, Takemikazuki stepped wrong and smiled like he admired the audacity. They went roof to roof, careful over cooking pots and children, demanding skill from the town and giving it back. Rukia cut a new ice lane without looking up. Grandmother shuffled along it with her jaw set and a baby at her chest. Azane's hands were red to the wrists, and she kept going. Hane's sigil stitched invisible rails through the crowd, lines that kept people from panicking into corners and dying there. Takemikazuki's sword flicked. A clothesline snapped. White shirts flew like doves that had decided against leaving. Naruto stepped on 2 of them without falling. He knew what the man was trying to do. Move the fight into a clean space where Naruto would either harm civilians or lose. Pick another hobby, Naruto said, and levered the wind under a falling beam to angle it away from heads. The beam slammed into a cistern and stopped there. Water fanned out and hissed against Rukia's ice. The hiss made sound. It was almost nauseating in the quiet. Takemikazuki came again. Faster. Naruto caught his blade, turned, and kept the turning, using the wind to slide the man's trajectory past a stall stacked with clay jugs without breaking a single one. Takemikazuki regarded the unbroken jugs as if measuring which Naruto valued more. The jugs are the joke. You were exactly as advertised, he said calmly. And then he was no longer interested in testing. He cut at a speed that drew a thin line across Naruto's shoulder and another at his hip. Naruto felt each slice with a familiar clarity that sharpened focus instead of blurring it. He didn't trade hurt for ground. He gave up nothing he couldn't afford. The tenement groaned again. Naruto couldn't hold the whole building with wrists and wind forever. He needed to end this fast or change the terrain. Hane's voice reached him through the gummed-up air. The single word she saved for when she had exactly one. Drop. He did. A sigil burst overhead and threw Takemikazuki's blade 2 inches wide. 2 inches is the difference between a cut and a regret. Naruto rolled, came up inside the man's guard, and elbowed him in the ribs. He felt satisfaction that wasn't pleasure. A clean, honest contact that said you're here with me. Takemikazuki took it, absorbed it, returned it with interest. Naruto's back hit a rooftop lip. He pushed off and landed on a ladder that led down to the alley. The ladder chose that moment to decide it was old. He coaxed it into being young for 2 steps and then flung himself sideways to a line of pennants, using them to arc to the next roof. A child clapped, then looked confused when his hands didn't make noise. Naruto saw the collapse coming a breath before Rukia did. The tenement had been waiting for this day for 3 years and choosing not to fall. Today it ran out of choices. He could hold the building together. He could keep fighting Takemikazuki. He could not do both and save everyone. He didn't think. Bankai, he said, because there are moments you sign the form while you run. The world tilted. The storm fox peeled out of him like ink flung into wind, a vast shape of whirling seals and breath, its tails carving isobars through sky. RMOR crawled over his skin in lines that felt like vows put on with a brush. The air took his words and tried to write them into weather. Tenrin Fujin Okatsun, he said, and the name wasn't for the rung. It was for the part of him that held back when it should step forward. The gale hit the street like a decision. The falling building paused as if embarrassed. Naruto drove the storm fox's paw's eye. Nto the corners where wood had lied about its strength, and the structure remembered itself for one more minute. People poured out along Hane's corridors, their hair snapped by wind that kept them upright instead of throwing them. Takemikazuki's blade whistled as though it enjoyed this. He came in under the arc of Naruto's left blade and struck at empty air as if striking at a word. Something cold slid along Naruto's spine. He recognized it a second too late. The Covenant's weapon wasn't interested in skin. It wanted nouns. He caught the strike on his right-hand blade and countered. 3 strokes, a kick. Wind driving his foot heavier than it was, but he was fighting on 2 battlefields now, against a man and against the part of his own power that liked to cut too much. Don't sever, he told the gale, out loud, and felt it strain to do what wind does to knots. Vow, the storm fox murmured through his bones, not words, but a pressure. Say it, bind me. He hated that he needed to. He did it anyway. No names, he said. And the gale bent to it. No bonds. The oath settled over the street. The wind didn't love being told what not to break. It listened. The tenement's joists chose this second to fail in a different place. A quarter of the structure began to fold. Hane was under it, one hand on a child's head, shoving air around him like sandbags. She looked up at Naruto. She didn't shout. She didn't have to. He pushed Bankai harder. The severance came thin and sweet, almost pleasant in the way bad ideas are. A gust that was an edge skated out from the storm fox's ribs, flicked like a careless sleeve, and grazed Hane's shoulder and the boy she had her palm over. The boy's name tore like paper when you pull too fast. Hane's went slippery at the edges. Naruto shut the Bankai down so fast his chest ached. The storm fox folded with a shudder that shook lanterns. Armor cracked away and left his skin cold. The building crashed the last of the way down, slow enough now that promised clones, hold that beam. Shield the doorway, could make the difference between crushed and bruised. Dust bloomed and then went obediently to ground because he asked. Hane froze, not in body. Her body kept moving because she knew how, but in the place a name sits. The boy's mother grabbed him and called him without sound. The boy looked back at her like a stranger trying to be polite. Azane was already there. She didn't yell at Naruto, though later she would, softly. She set her fingers at the base of Hane's skull and thumbed a point under the ear like ringing a bell on purpose. Stay, she told Hane, and meant the parts that were trying to step away. Her other hand found the boy's pulse. Stay, she told him, too, and it was a command people obey even when sick. Naruto stepped to them and the wind gathered. Ashamed and ready, he didn't touch Hane. He wanted to. He didn't. He touched the air around the boy instead, cupped it, made a little bowl. He had no right to make a vow right now. Vows had teeth. He used intention like thread. Kenji, he said, the boy from yesterday, not this boy, but the name in his mouth was a path, and sometimes paths find each other. He pulled. Not hard. He hated hard. He eased. The boy's face turned toward his mother and cleared like glass wiped with a sleeve. Mama, he said, surprise making sound. Hane's eyes were bright and wrong. Naruto tasted metal he hadn't put there. Azane didn't look at him. Give me something personal, she said to Hane, voice steady. Anything you have from a day you liked. Hane's mouth twitched. Left sleeve, she said, dry even now. Second fold. Azane found a dull coin the size of a thumbnail, cheap, from a festival stall. She pressed it to the chalk-stained knuckle of Hane's right hand. Stay, she told the memory inside the coin. Stay, and pull her with you. Her hand shook once and then was still because she required it. Captain, she said without turning her head, choose how to use that power or don't use it at all. Understood, Naruto said. It sounded too clean to be true. He meant it anyway. Hane blinked. The wrong brightness went out of her eyes like a light cupped against wind. She swayed, then planted her feet and didn't allow it. She looked at Naruto like a person who has just read an invoice and found their name printed where someone else's should have been. Next time, she said, voice calm. Sign the forms before you try to erase me. He laughed. He couldn't help it. It came out thin. Yes, Lieutenant, She squeezed the coin until the cheap metal bent. "Don't ask me for the mundane paperwork now," she said. "I will write you into oblivion with it later," he said. Takemikazuki had not run. He stood 20 paces away, blade lowered, watching Azane's hands. As if learning a language he'd been too proud to study. He tilted his head, and for the first time a crack in his composure showed, not pity. Not doubt. Consideration. "Bankai," he said, tasting the word like a critic. "You injure names with your storm. Interesting." Naruto pulled breath through his teeth. "I fix what I break," he said. "Not always," Takemikazuki said. He didn't sound smug, which somehow made it worse. "Your restraint will kill fewer than your power might save. It will also let some die you could have saved. This is arithmetic." Naruto stepped forward. "So is yours," he said. "You count bodies where they're tidy. I count them where they're messy." The man's mouth almost smiled. "We will do this again," he said, like an invitation to a funeral, and then was gone the way Lee. Ghtning is gone, without footsteps to catalog. Silence softened. Not a lot. Enough that a man could clear his throat and be heard. Rukia's ice sluices melted where they were supposed to. The grandma, with the baby sat on a stoop and let the air back into her lungs. A bird decided to be brave, or stupid, and called once from the mouth of an alley. Naruto put a hand on his own knee for a second and let the weight of it remind him that he was still a body that needed holding up. He met Azane's eyes. She held his gaze for one beat too long and then looked away, not to spare him, but to keep doing. The thing she did better than anyone, keep people. Kana arrived at a run like a science experiment in 3 different stages. She took one look at Hane, at the coin bent into a rude smile, and at the dust cloud, and swore softly. "If you're going to break reality," she told Naruto, "please leave me a margin note." "Working on it," he said. She knelt by one of the masked corpses that hadn't had the decency to vanish. Up close the mask looked cheap, a copy made by someone with good hands and worse ethics. She unstrapped a bracer and rolled the sleeve up. Sigils lined the forearm. Precise, ugly. "They're not just using the nails," she said. "They're inscribing accelerants into people. Names as reagents. Can you trace it?" Hane asked. Voice normal now, only one syllable snagging for a blink when she said trace. Kana's mouth went flat. "I can trace forgery. But this is like following a smell through a market. Too many stalls. Too much frying oil." "Ledger," Naruto said, thinking of Yoruichi's rooftop cache, of the nails. Of the seal. Somewhere there's a supply chain with a clerk who thinks he's laundering paper and not blood. Kana's eyes unfocused in the way they did when she redrew a city in her head with dotted lines and variables. If the nails come through the dongai, if they're staging caches in the flow, she snapped her fingers. Yes, that would explain the timing. Heat drains feel regular because someone is imposing a schedule. "Can you prove it?" Rukia asked. There was ice in her tone, but it wasn't for Kana. It was for the men in rooms. Kana fished a stained slip out of her satchel. Oil paper, humming, the little charm she'd handed Naruto dressed in a new wrapper. "Not with a speech," she said. "With theft." Naruto looked at the street. Bandages, tea being poured. Neighbors who hadn't liked each other yesterday sharing a stool because chairs were scarce. He looked at Hane, at the smudge of chalk on her throat and the bite of a cheap coin in her palm. He looked at Azane washing dust off a cut with a tenderness it didn't deserve and Kana already drawing schematics on her thigh with a charred matchstick. "Then we steal," he said. Hane didn't correct him. Rukia didn't advise caution, which was its own sort of warning. Azane, without looking up, said, "Bring back what helps. Burn what hurts." Kana, already moving, said, "I told you I liked you." They spent the rest of the afternoon doing the unglamorous part. Sweeping glass, filling buckets, counting who needed a bed and who could go home. Naruto walked the length of the block 3 times, pressing a palm to doorframes and saying stay where the wood wanted to sag. He apologized to the wind twice for being angry at it. The wind apologized back by keeping dust out of a baby's nose. By twilight the ward had a pulse again. It was thin. It held. They convened on a water tower that had seen better paint. Yoruichi was already there, barefoot on metal as if it were beach sand. She handed A bottle that smelled like not water and watched with interest when Hane didn't drink it, but looked at it until her name sat solid on her tongue again, then handed it back. You'll tell me how you did that later, Yoruichi said. Not unkindly. Trade you for how you keep your balance when you really shouldn't, Hane said. Deal, Yoruichi grinned. Naruto put the charm Kana had given him WN on the metal and weighted it with his haori so it wouldn't slide. Talk me through it, he said. Kana crouched, hairpin skewed, eyes bright and mean the way lightning looks over hills. The Kavana, NT is moving name nails and quiet blades through the dongai because it lets them hop records. There's an account, 4 transactions, each with seals that nearly pass. The 5th would bring in something labeled lantern. The ledger calls it a devotional instrument. She made a face. It's an old designation. Antique. Royal Guard era nomenclature. Lantern, Rukia said, tasting memory. We trained on stories about one. A device that holds names the way a ship holds air in its hull. If it's the same, it could restore what's severed, Azane finished quietly. Or extinguish it without fuss. Naruto looked at Hane. She was fine now. She would be. He still put his palm down on the metal near her knee, not touching, close enough that if she leaned she would find his hand there. She didn't lean. She knew. Where? He asked Kana. She tapped the charm. Dongai. Off the main current. A shrine the instruments don't chart because instruments don't like being made to do poetry. You'll need speed and stubbornness. She glanced at Yoruichi. And someone who treats walls like suggestions. Flatter me more, Yoruichi said, already rolling her shoulders. Rukia set her hand on the haori where it weighted the charm. A small and unshowy pledge. I'll go, she said. They shouldn't be allowed to do this in our house. Azane slapped the tower's rail with 2 fingers and then her own wrist, as if setting a rhythm for a procedure. You'll need someone to tell you when to stop before you fall in love with the hurting, she said. I'll go, Kana sniffed. I wasn't asking permission to go, she said. You will all perish without me. And I look terrible in memorial paintings. Lieutenant, Naruto asked Hane, not because he doubted her answer but because asking was its own respect. Hane didn't look at him. She watched the city instead, where lanterns below were learning to be brave again. Where you go, she said, my maps go. If you ruin them, I'll ruin you. Understood, he said, relieved by the threat. You're not asking me, Yoruichi said, amused. You'd go if I asked you not to, he said. Correct, she said, and hopped down from the rail like gravity had decided she didn't need to be consulted. They let the plan build itself the way good ones do, from what each person already did best. Yoruichi would burn misdirection runs along the current. Rukia and Hane would braid Kido. 2 ways, one to stretch seconds into something useful, one to fold distance if panic required it. Azane would carry a metronome, taps against Naruto's wrist to keep his heart honest when the dongai decided to rewrite counts. Kana would mark anti-silence vectors with that impossible instrument she claimed was a multi-tempered Vibra compass, which sounded fake and wasn't. Naruto would get them out if things went bad. He also had to be the one to light whatever the lantern was, because his blade loved names enough to behave around them if he told it to. Tomorrow, he said when the shape of it felt right in his mouth. Before dawn, Hane said. Before you talk yourself into gentler ideas, Kana amended. Azane looked at the bruised block below. People will still need bandages. They always do, Naruto said. They climbed down. The ward had started to smell like rice again. Someone was singing a song about a river and getting the words wrong on purpose to make a child laugh. Rukia walked toward a group of officers and never raised her voice. They straightened anyway. Yoruichi vanished the way you forget a dream when you decide to get out of bed. Kana muttered into her satchel about nails and scandal. Azane put a hand on Naruto's sleeve and left it there for 1 heartbeat as both benediction and threat. Don't make me hate you, she said. I'm trying not to, he said. Hane waited at the corner. The coin lay in her palm, bent and silly. She flipped it once and caught it. You're going to ask the wind to do too much again, she said. I'm going to ask it to do just enough, he said. And let the truth of the intention sit there, naked, because he had no business dressing it up. She watched his face like a map, finding where the roads had shifted since morning. I heard you, she said finally. When it grazed me, you said my name like you were pulling on a rope. I will be more careful, he said. You will fail at that, she said, not unkindly. I will fail less, he said. She huffed. Acceptable. Then, after a beat, level. Don't apologize again unless you've changed something. I don't like apologies used for architecture. I'll change, he said. He didn't vow it. He didn't need to. She'd know. They walked the last stretch to the barracks together without talking. At the door he hung the haori on its peg and smoothed it twice. The wind at the threshold stayed very still, braced like a runner waiting for the gun. Sleep, Hane said. Does that still work? He asked. Sometimes, she said. If you make it. He lay down on a mat without undressing because he knew Dawn was mean. He didn't ask the wind to stand guard. It already was. He thought of Kenji, and of the boy today who had been almost Kenji and then was, and of Takemikazuki's blade trying to slice the part of a man that isn't muscle. He thought of a lantern he hadn't seen yet and the way names feel when you hold them like eggs. Easy to break if you forget you're holding them, easy to protect if you remember you are. Outside, Seraite relearned its own noise. Somewhere a washerwoman told a joke with a curse in it and someone pretended to be shocked and loved her for it. The city slept crooked and that was good enough. Naruto closed his eyes. Tomorrow, they would go steal from a shrine in a river that wasn't a river. He would ask too much of himself, and the people with him would carry what spilled over. He would remember to sign the forms. He slept. Chapter 3 End. Chapter 4. The Shrine Beyond the Current. They left before dawn while the lanterns still believed the night. The bar. Racks smelled like starch and ink and plans that had been written and erased and written again. Naruto tied his sash twice, once for ritual and once for luck, then lifted his haori and let it hang crow. Because straight lines make bad promises in moving places. Equipment check, Kana said, already irritated with them all. She held up the Vibra compass, a tin disc the size of a rice bowl, its FA.CE scored with concentric rings and hair-thin needles that vibrated without touching anything. If it buzzes like a mosquito, that's a silence seam. If it hums like a kettle, that's a name current. If it stops, run. Encouraging, Yoruichi said, slinging a small pack over one shoulder. She was barefoot because shoes are opinions. Rukia lifted a coil of keto braid she and Hane had tied for hours. The night before, strips of paper sigils laced with silk thread, each mark placed with the neat fury of people who prefer rules when they're useful. 2 effects, she murmured. A stretch, a fold. Hane checked the chalk case on her belt, then looked at Naruto's wrists like she was measuring pulse and stubbornness at once. Azane came last, carrying nothing that looked like a weapon and half the things you use to keep people alive after the news has already hurt them. They stepped into the dongai, which is a lie. You don't step into the dongai. You let the floor take its hands off you and decide that forward is still a direction. At once the world narrowed to a corridor of pressure, a long throat swallowing time. Blue-white current burned past without light or water. The first sound was T. He steady tap-tap at Naruto's wrist, Azane's metronome, 2 fingers drumming his pulse back to human when the corridor tried to make it metrical and unkind. Left, Kana said, voice tight. The Vibra compass thrummed against her palm. Low seam. Ride it for speed. Don't look at it while you do. Yoruichi ghosted forward and the current missed her. No, she slid along the edge where missing looked like skill. Rukia and Hane planted the braid at elbow height and it took seconds stretching like warm sugar between knots. Naruto's shoulder hit a crosswind that wasn't wind. He leaned into it without fighting. And the corridor accepted the compromise. A sound started far away. A slow, offended roar. The cleaner. Don't race it, Azane said, not panicked. Match it. It eats panic. Everything eats panic, Hane muttered, setting a talisman on Naruto's sleeve and another on the braid. This one burps politely. They moved faster anyway, because even good advice has to share a room with survival. The corridor widened and then narrowed like a lung. Kana thrust the Vibra compass ahead. It sang in 2 notes at once. Fork, she said, we take the ugly one. Yoruichi flickered down the neat path and then reappeared, shaking her head. Too perfect, she said. It wants us to trust it. Hane sketched a box in the air and shaded one corner with her thumb. That corner bites, she said. Ugly it is, Naruto agreed, and took the left-hand ravel where the current fought itself. It slapped his shins like reeds. He grinned without showing teeth, because anyone can dance on smooth boards and he spent a life learning to find rhythm in broken places. The cleaner's howl surged closer. It didn't sound like one thing. It sounded like all the times you tried to be faster than a door. Yoruichi stopped playing, turned, and sprinted along the wall. Fine, not a wall, the place the corridor pretends it ends. She flicked a hand and left a thread of ryutsu there, a lure that read indignant and almost caught. Feeding it bad choices, she said, amused. Works on men, too. Rukia laughed once, quick, and threw a lattice of Kido behind them, a frost that caught the edges of time and made them ring true. The cleaner sniffed, or whatever it did, and lunged for Yoruichi's rumor instead of their bodies. They hit stairs that didn't exist, steps cut into space because someone had decided rituals should have risers. Takemikazuki stood at the top of them, a silhouette against non-sky, looking down with the patient attention of a butcher who takes pride in sharp knives. I would have come to your door, he said conversationally. But this corridor is closer to your habits. Less paperwork here, Naruto said. Rukia and Hane didn't wait for permission. They set the braid in a noose around the first two risers and drew it tight. Bending seconds into a loop, Kana hunched over the compass and scratched two quick lines with a stylus. The hum changed pitch, undercutting silence with a rude little buzz. Azane's fingers kept the metronome on Naruto's wrist steady. Yoruichi vanished, reappeared behind Takemikazuki, flicked his mask with a single finger to read the balance of his attention, and vanished again before the blade could make its opinion known. Captain, Takemikazuki said, and moved. The duel started without show. He came in like a rule. Naruto met him like an exception that still respects grammar. Edge on edge, except one edge was wind and one was a law pretending to be steel. Naruto tried to keep the fight low, off the stairs and away from the braid. If time kinked wrong, they'd drown in it. Takemikazuki's slash sought not flesh but the link between Naruto and the air. Naruto stopped it with a twist of wrist that invited the strike to miss by a thumb's width. Iston still left a sensation across his grip like someone had filed conviction out of his fingers. Promise clones? Takemikazuki asked, reading the currents as easily as if they were posted rules. 1, Naruto said, and let the air thicken beside him into a boy with empty eyes and a single thought. Take the hit meant for the one behind me. The clone nodded and waited like the simplest soldier in the world. Wasteful, Takemikazuki said, almost kind. He fainted high. Naruto didn't bite. The man's blade bit low toward the braid. Ah, Naruto said, and stepped into it. The clone moved without needing words and caught the impossible cut with its chest. The blade passed through the intent, not the body. It shredded purpose and left shreds of a man-shaped idea tumbling. The clone looked at Naruto, nothing in it but did I do it? And vanished. Naruto's jaw clicked once. Not wasteful, he said. Invested. Takemikazuki permitted himself the smallest adjustment in stance, the kind men ma. When they decide to take you seriously. He accelerated. The first 3 cuts came on the same beat, one at Naruto's knee, one at his wrist, one at the air of his throat. Naruto answered each with minimal motion, letting the wind be cloth where metal would have rung. The 4th cut slid in sideways, clever, almost playful, and nicked Naruto's cheek. He felt warmth, tasted iron, and it helped. He didn't want to call Bankai here. He didn't want to be a storm in a corridor of glass. He also didn't want to lose the braid or the people he had brought. Sorry, he told the air, not performative at all, and let it armor him. Bankai. The storm fox unfolded, bigger here than in streets, its tails carving arcs that made the corridor turn its head. Inked wind seals scrolled over Naruto's forearms and shoulders. Their strokes full of grammar he had learned by doing. The gale wanted to tear. He gave it instructions in the only language it obeyed, a vow said like a craftsman's sketch. No names, he told it again, and added. No friends. The fox exhaled. The corridor bowed. Takemikazuki didn't flinch. He cut through the first tail. An impossible motion, except it wasn't a tail, it was a rule about pressure. The cut made a scar in weather. Naruto ignored the wounded pride of it and put the wind under his own feet. He turned the step into a glide, slipped past Takemikazuki's center, and It his left hand blade along the man's ribs without committing to killing. It wasn't leniency, it was aim. Takemikazuki hissed very quietly and returned a line along Naruto's hip, a fair trade they'd both refused to make twice. They locked close. Naruto smelled something like cedar and lightning on the man, the scent of rehearsed cruelty. He twisted, set a heel, and threw Takemikazuki backward onto a riser. The law blade bit into stone and the stair declined to be split. Enough, Yoruichi said from behind the man's shoulder, and tapped a precise point in his back with 3 fingers. He jerked just enough that his next cut went wide. Thank you, Naruto said. Don't get sentimental, Yoruichi said, but she grinned. They didn't have time to finish the argument. The corridor's pressure nged, the cleaner remembering them, and the Vibra compass went from mosquito to angry kettle. Move, Kana barked. If you're going to live now. Takemikazuki slid from the step with the smoothness of an apology never given. He looked at Naruto for a fractional heartbeat, assessment recalculated, and then blurred into the upper dark, toward a different angle of stairs. We will do this again, he said, and disappeared. Can't wait, Naruto muttered. They ran the last stretch, the braid humming between Rukia and Hane like a string. The corridor opened into a space that wasn't space, a courtyard inside silence. It had pillars because shrines like pillars. It had a roof because roofs reassure mortals. The floor had the look of stone walked for centuries by bare feet. The air tasted like tea. A moment before you decide not to speak. At the center sat the void shrine. It didn't sit, not really. It refused to stand. It occupied. Shijima waited. Not a figure, no face. An absence in the shape of a seated god. All edges rounded by nothing. You could look directly and see nothing. You could look away and feel it watching you without eyes. When Naruto inhaled, the place tried to edit the breath into a more civilized silence. He kept it impolite. Don't say anything you aren't willing to lose, Hane warned, voice laid thin and steady. Not even each other's names. Especially not each other's names, Azane added. Fingers on his wrist reminding the world that human hearts have their own drumline. Kana pointed with her chin. Lantern. It stood half behind the knot figure, unlit, a CAGE of rings and panes and thin-etched plates, no flame, no wick. Its surface was covered in characters too delicate to be called script, more like the idea of script remembered by a fever. It hummed a TA frequency that felt like someone calling your childhood nickname from a different room. Rukia's breath snagged. Old, she whispered, reverent without being romantic, older than our rules for how to love our rules. Naruto approached until his shin burned with the sense of a line and stopped. We take it, it sees us, he said. We light it, it sees us more. It already does, Yoruichi said cheerfully. She tilted her head at the knot figure. Heard of you, sorry to disappoint. I don't worship. Shijima did not answer because answering would have been a verb. The first test came quiet and cheap. A ripple, like heat. The keto braid loosened around their waists without moving because the idea of knot had been sanded. Rukia and Hane both caught it at once, fingers sealing marks with the speed of handwriting names in a storm. The braid tightened again, a living thing refusing a leash. Second test. Chalk lines burned off Hane's belt, colorless fire erasing careful contour. Kana made a disapproving noise. Slapped a sigil to the stone with spit and knuckle, and the lines reappeared because she had written them again with wool instead of chalk. Right angry, she said. Shijima's attention, if you could call it that, shifted. It fixed on Naruto the way a lake fixes on a man who throws stones because the stones are rude. It tried, gently, to untie the bow of his haori. No, he said. Then, softer, not today. He stepped to the lantern and felt the air pull his name like taffy. It didn't take, it tasted. He withdrew his hand and licked the back of his teeth and found metal there. Don't touch it bare, Azane said. Her voice had a doctor's weight. Not law, habit. She wrapped a strip of cloth around his hand and another around her own and passed him a loop, so if he fell he'd take her with him in a way neither of them would forgive but both would plan for. Kana was already moving to the base, reading etched instructions that weren't in words. It's not lit by fire, she said. It's lit by registration. You inscribe something you mean and it burns on purpose. An oath, Hane said quietly. Naruto's shoulder drew itself up like a boy made to stand in class. No names, he began. And the lantern pushed back. Old rule, be specific, without sound. No extinguishing, he tried. Only restoration. The hum changed. Not agreement, consideration. The not figure shifted, not with movement, with subtraction. A breeze that wasn't wind looked at Rukia's sword and tried to forget it. She laid a palm on her hilt and whispered without sound to the blade. The blade remembered itself because it loved her voice. Faster, Kana hissed. It's learning us, Captain, Hane said, and the carefulness in her tone made his stomach knot. He turned. Her outline frayed. Not much. The edge of her jaw wore air like wool. The coin she'd bent yesterday was dull in her fist, its curve a tired smile. When she blinked, the space where her name sits didn't blink with her. Hey, Naruto said, too gentle. Like approaching a startled horse. Stay with me. I am, she said, and her mouth made the shape of I am without the rest of the sentence attaching. Azane swore for once. You have seconds, she said. 3, 4. If she insults you. Hane managed a twitch of the eyebrow that counted as an insult and bought them a breath. The knot figure fed on it, amused. Naruto set both hands on the lantern, cloth biting his palms. And did the thing he least wanted. He offered. Take from me, he said. Not brave. Necessary. The lantern quivered, interested. Not a friend. Not a stranger, he said. Choosing like a man pulling splinters. Take a piece I can give and live with. Azane's grip tightened on the loop. Naruto. He swallowed the warning and picked up the quietest part of hymns. LF. A syllable in his own name that only mattered to people who loved saying the whole of it. He held it up inside, a small bright thing he'd never thought of as separate. He hated it and loved it at once. Take this, he told the lantern. Bind it to restore. It did. The syllable left him with a clean sting, the way it feels to give blood on a good day. He felt the absence immediately, a hollow. In the mouth that would change nothing and everything about how people said him. He did not name which part it was. He would not. The lantern woke. Light rose without flame, the panes filling with AG. Low that looked like ink deciding to be warm. Etched plates brightened, characters joining where they'd been shy. The hum smoothed until it sang a note so steady his knees wanted to give out in relief. Hane snapped back like a thread pulled through fabric. She reeled once, cheap coin cutting her palm, and then stood up straight as herself. Her eyes found him and stayed. Don't, she said, and it was. Accusation and plea and gratitude all tied in one mean knot she didn't have hands to untie. Later, he said, because if he softened now the shrine would take it. The lantern's light drew Shijima's whole attention at last. The knot figure's edges came closer by not moving. The braid went taut as a bow. Yoruichi rolled her shoulders, pleased. Now we run, she said. They didn't run. They executed. A retreat that looked like choreography because it had to. Rukia lifted the braid and folded a length of corridor behind them so footsteps slid off to nowhere. Hane pressed sigils that turned empty pace into stairs just long enough to use. Kana shoved the Vibra compass into Azane's satchel and put both hands on the lantern's frame, half in love, half in threat. Shijima unstood. An unhand tried to reach the lantern. Naruto pivoted, set his shoulder to no, and let the storm fox stretch up behind him, not to slash, but to lean. Not yours, he told the god of quiet. Not this, not them. Shijima took something else instead. He couldn't tell what, only that a heat went out of his mouth and left it cool. He didn't look for it. Gifts given are gone. The cleaner's howl bled back into hearing as the shrine's room pushed them out. Yoruichi's decoy threads led it up and away. The lantern fought to be heavy. Kana swore and threatened to leave it if it didn't learn manners. It lightened, offended. The corridor narrowed to a pipe and then widened into a square that pretended to be a courtyard. Time tried to stand like a soldier and make them show papers. Rukia held up the braid and the papers stamped themselves. The last obstacle was pettier. A seam that turned everything in it into a copy. Yoruichi went through and came out 3 Yoruichis deep, all smirking. Don't fall in love, she said, and 2 of her evaporated. Naruto walked through and felt the lantern's glow try to split like soap bubbles. He cupped it with promise, not vow. Stay one, be enough. They spilled out where the Dongai shook their city's hand. The courtyard waited with its honest stone. The first real noise was the whir of Kana's compass, calming from kettle to mosquito to nothing. After that came the sound. D of Azane's breath as she finally let herself be human again. Inventory, Rukia said, calm, and touched each of them with a glance the way a commander touches numbers. Yoruichi wiggled her fingers, all there. Kana patted herself down in the order only she understands. Azane flexed her hands and closed her eyes for one long beat. Hane looked at Naruto and then at the lantern and then at her chalk, which had somehow survived in the curve of her palm. Costs, she asked. Naruto rolled his jaw and tasted the shape of his own name and found a new hollow where a familiar weight had been. He filed it away without ceremony and without self-pity. Some, he said. Enough. Shijima, Rukia asked, low, watching. Yoruichi said, tipping her head back as if listening to a ceiling you can't see. And learning body language. Then we move, Azane said. Before the men who think runes are the world notice we took something from outside their rooms. They did not parade. They ghosted. Hane scree. BB led a map with the economy of someone who wasted nothing she'd need later. Kana carried the lantern with both reverence and disdain. The lantern cooperated with the martyred air of an antique who has waited too long to be useful and intends to be insufferable about it. They made it across 3 courts and 2 alleys before politics found them anyway. A squad of Central 46 attendants, crisp as envelopes, stepped into their path. The man at the front wore a face he must have practiced in a mirror, wounded authority. He looked at the lantern and then at Naruto and chose to scold the person he thought would take it best. Captain, he said, you are not authorized to remove artifacts from. Walk with me, Naruto said, not slowing. If you can keep up. The man did, offended lungs heaving. You cannot. I can, Naruto said. You can escalate. We can waste our afternoon deciding whether the world is on fire while the world is on fire, or you can help us bring water. Where did you find? In a place that exists whether you stamp it or not, Naruto said. Pick, paper or people. The attendants exchanged looks, the kind that happen in doorways when pride and practicality bump shoulders. The leader decided, to his credit, to be useful instead of right. Where do you need to go? He asked. Somewhere with walls that won't lie, Rukia said. And a table that can hold history. They ended up in a training hall because training halls put up with truth. Kana set the lantern at the center and the room's air settled around it like a circle of elders around a fire. Hane laid chalk marks on the floor. Not in sigils this time but in pairs of names. Little Taka plus Amiko, Hajime plus Akari, couples she had watched call to one another in emergencies and come when called. Azane added a Han. DFUL of thread. Bracelets cut from wrists when bandages had to be tied fast, saved because she is the sort of woman who saves threads. Rukia placed her hand on Zangetsu's hilt and nodded once, devoting her sword's patience to the moment. Naruto touched the lantern again and felt it eager and shy at once. He thought of the boys and mothers, of beams held up by palms, of a coin bent into a smile. He didn't make a speech. He didn't vow. He gave the lantern a direction the way you point a lost child toward home. Restore, he said. The lantern inhaled. Light lifted off its etched plates and poured like quiet water along the chalk lines. Names hummed without being said aloud. Somewhere in Ward 10 a woman calling from a window felt an answer come before her mouth made the sound. Somewhere in Road 7 a man who had forgotten how his brother's laugh bent on the last beat remembered and sat down, shaking, to let it pass through him. Not everyone, not everything, enough that the air tasted like something other than loss. Azane's shoulders dropped a fraction. Rukia closed her eyes as if listening to snow. Kana wiped one eye with the heel of her hand and then growled at herself for doing it. Hane looked at Naruto as if he'd asked the world politely to be a little less cruel and it had agreed for the hour. Down the hall, on a mat someone had left unrolled, a young officer in plain clothes poked his head in. Captain Naru, he began, stumbled, colored, and corrected, Captain. Message from the commander. Naruto smiled without showing the bruise it pressed from the inside. Later, he said, we're busy being useful. When the first wave of restoring finished, the lantern dimmed to a bearable glow. It would burn again when asked. He felt it. He also felt the afterimage of Shijima's attention. Like a hand pressed too long to cool glass. The shrine had noticed. He'd invited that. Sleep. Azane ordered the room, although no one would. Breathe. Drink. Hide it. Rukia asked, chin lifting toward the lantern. Not yet, Yoruichi said, eyes on the ceiling again. If we hide it, the god will look harder. Leave it where gods still think humility looks good on us. Tomorrow, Hane said, and her voice had the steadiness of chalk after a storm. We find where they're hammering the nails from. We cut the line. Tomorrow, Kana agreed, vicious and bright. And I will ember. Ass a man in a robe so badly he will change professions. Naruto touched the lantern one last time and felt, under the hum, the empty place he had given it on purpose. He let himself mourn it with the same economy he used for everything else. Then he set his palm on the floor and asked the wind to stay. Not to blow, not to guard, just to stay, like a watchman who refuses to blink while the street learns its noise again. The wind agreed. It always had, when he asked it like that. Outside, Seraite lifted its head, as if the city itself had heard its name returned from somewhere deep. Somewhere far, beyond walls and corridors and good intentions, a shrine that isn't a shrine listened back. It didn't plan. Gods don't, but they learn. He looked at his people. Yoruichi's grin. Rukia's still water. Azane's steel under skin. Kana's teeth. Hane's line of a mouth that hid laughter and anger both. He had brought them into a place that erased meanings and taken something from himself to buy a margin. He would do it again. He also intended to do it better. Eat, he said, because sometimes leadership is that small. Then we go write theft into a ledger. Finally, Kana said, vicious with delight. A paper crime. Naruto laughed, not loud. The lantern warmed under his hand as if pleased to be a noun again. He lifted his palm, rolled his shoulders once, and let the rune be a rune for a while. Tomorrow would try to erase them. Today, they had written themselves in ink. Chapter 4 End. Chapter 5. Say it and make it true. Before dawn, Seraite forgot how to make noise. It happened without ceremony. One breath, a cook stoked a brazier, coughed, and swore at the smoke. The next, the smoke curled in perfect silence and the swear became a shape with no teeth. Bells swung. They looked like bells. Their tongues hit bronze and committed to the motion. Nothing answered. Naruto woke to the wind hiding under the door like a dog that had done something wrong and didn't know what. He swung his feet to the floor and felt the lack like a bruise on the room. Hane pushed the door open with chalk already in her hand. She didn't waste a question. She handed him a stub. He pocketed it. Outside, the silence curtain had fallen like gauze over everything, soft, complete, cruel. You could see the pattern in it where it sagged across rooflines and caught on corners. Men pointed and then remember. Pointing is a language that requires someone else to be fluent. Naruto took the nearest wall and wrote in big block letters with a hand that didn't shake. Hold the west gate, count to 50, then run. Don't let anyone be alone. He underlined the last twice. Kana skidded up, hair askew, eyes wired, and slapped the name lantern into his hands like a child pushing a stranger their most precious toy. It throbbed under his palm, warm with that dignified indignation antiques have when forced back into service. Map, Kana mouthed, stabbing at the lantern and then at her own chest so hard her knuckle left a bruise. She opened a padded case and brought out a frame of glass threaded with copper. She wedged it under the lantern's base, fiddled 2 switches, and the whole thing began to throw a FAI.NT constellation onto the hall's far wall. Embers spattered across an outline of the city. Names, not words, people, each ember stubborn as a hearth. Some flickered, some were already dark. Rukia was a thin slice of discipline at his left shoulder, hair in a knot that had not dared come loose. She didn't try to speak. She tapped the west edge of the map and then the east, 2 question marks placed with her thumbnail. Yoruichi appeared and vanished from 3 different places to make sure their eyes were following the same picture. Azane's hand found Naruto's wrist and asked his pulse to remember what steady feels like. He led it. They moved without sound but not without orders. Orders took shape in chalk, in the way a hand could describe a circle, a square, a path. Hane's sigils hit stone T ankle height so fleeing feet would feel guidance in their bones. Kana ran through the barracks with the lantern held like a scandal, angling it up and down so embers blazed brighter where squads were clumped and dimmer where gaps opened. She turned it into a net that draped their city from inside out. Naruto didn't try to be everywhere. He chose corners and made them behave. A courtyard was starting to veer toward Panic's geometry. Witches' circles that collapse. He wrote line here on flagstones and put a promise clone 6 paces down the alley. Do not let anyone pass without a hand on the shoulder and a nod. The clone nodded at the first man like a gate with feelings, and the man nodded back because he needed a ritual more than a speech. The flow corrected. People moved instead of jamming. On the 6th Street, a silence lake had formed, an actual visible puddle where the air had thickened into nothing. It opened like a mouth into the curtain. Rukia stepped to the edge, eyes narrowed, and slid her blade into the surface with reverence and cruelty in the correct ratio. Ice spidered out, not to conquer, but to brace. The lake stopped eating the cobbles. Yoruichi dropped from a roof, hair a streak, smacked a half-concealed seal hidden under a lantern with the heel of her hand, and it snapped like a twig. 3 more in 30 breaths. Each one released a little of the curtain's weight, as if someone loosening a too-tight bandage. She didn't grin. She had a grin in her pocket if needed. Azane made a new clinic out of a school porch and ran it with the authority of a woman who will not be denied. She showed men twice her size where to stand with 2 fingers. She stitched Ryutsu like muscle, tapped pulses to keep them honest, scolded a lieutenant with a look when he tried to die politely. When her eyes met Naruto's over a boy's head, she jabbed 2 fingers at the lantern. More, she mouthed. He took it into the street where chalk arrows had grown like weeds. The curtain tried to ignore the lantern. The lantern refused to be ignored. He tilted it so the map poured along eaves and windows, the embers dotting where people still had enough of themselves to be found. He bent the light at one corner with a finger and it rolled into a tight curl, an alley where the dots were blinking out like someone pinching candles. He ran. Hane held his pace without drama, chalk and paw. Her dancing from her sleeves in a rhythm that left rails of intention for people to follow if they could still remember following. At the alley, a child sat on a step and looked at his own hands like they were tools he had not been trained to use. A woman stood and didn't know if she had a name she liked. Naruto set the lantern down on the step and put his palm on the boy's hair. He didn't make a vow and feed the blade more than he could afford. He made a promise that was small and useful. Stay put. He wrote on the stone with chalk, then wiped it and wrote move when she tugs and pointed to the woman. He gave the boy the lantern's handle to hold while he wrote. The boy's fingers curled around it like he'd known it forever. The lantern brightened in embarrassed satisfaction. Names in the S. Surrounding apartments flickered and then steadied as if someone had tightened screws in the walls. They wove through a city turning its own breath back on. Not everywhere. Not enough. Enough to make trying reasonable. At the outer ring, the curtain stiffened, and it became very, very clear. This was not merely a god's whim. The absence had anchors. A seal the size of a tavern lay stamped into the dirt where a plaza had been in love with summer festivals. Its characters were ugly in a bureaucratic way. Naruto bent and felt them through his fingers. They weren't Shinigami work. They weren't hollow. They were right angles and malice. The Covenant, Hane wrote in small neat script beside the seal. Kana slammed the lantern's base down next to the characters and it sang in the tone it used for lies. She flung open her satchel and dragged out an ugly little hammer and a set of chisels that had no right to hum. Yoruichi arrived like a smile at a funeral and tapped a corner with 2 fingers. The seal shuddered. Naruto crouched, glanced at the lantern's dim reflection, and used his left hand blade to shave a hair's width from a stroke that thought it was necessary. The curtain above them gathered to retort. Rukia planted a line of ice around the edge of the plaza and the retort slipped. They broke 3 seals in 10 minutes and ran toward the 4th. The 4th moved. Takemikazuki wa LKED the face of it like a man inspecting a bridge he had just commissioned. The law blade at his hip drank light without greed. He looked at Naruto with an expression that didn't have contempt in it anymore. It might have had boredom. Which was worse, because that meant respect disguised as a problem to solve. Naruto set the lantern behind him without looking and stepped forward. The curtain leaned. In so hard the edges of buildings went soft. You could cut silence with this thickness if you shaped it right. Everyone in the plaza, even children, knew what they were watching. Takemikazuki did not announce himself. He lifted his sword and the first cut didn't go for Naruto's ribs or his throat or the obvious. It went for his voice. Naruto felt the blade try to slice the part of him that says stop and makes crowds stop. That says hold and makes beams hold. That says I've got you and means it. He rolled his wrist, and the wind ran between hand and law like water over stone, making the strike miss what it wanted. He took the slice in meat instead. Blood made polite red on the ground. He didn't watch it. He kept the fight where it belonged. Away from Rukia's ice and Kana's hammer, away from Hane's chalk rails. Away from the people who had started to write instructions on their own door lintels because he had written first and the urge is contagious. He kept the fight small inside of something huge. Takemikazuki's eyes flicked to the lantern, to Hane's hand, to Kana's mouth. Naruto cut a line into the ground that meant do not step past this if you value your knees. Takemikazuki stepped past it because he did not. The next stroke caught Naruto's left sleeve and carved out a cloth wedge like a cookie. Naruto turned that wedge into wind and smacked the man in the ear with it. It sounded like nothing. The sensation promised a headache. They circled the seal. The law blade's edge kept looking for grammar in Naruto. Naruto kept offering it accent instead of syntax, sliding cuts, checks that felt like stumbles. Jokes he didn't have to say out loud. The curtain breathed. The lantern burned. The city watched. You're very good at not letting me do the thing I'm designed to do, Takemikazuki said. Almost a compliment. You're very good at trying to erase what I am, Naruto said, entirely a description. They hit the corner of a stall. Naruto shoved the stall clear with a hip so gentle it bordered on tender. The law blade kissed the stall's post and failed to unname wood because the post had been in this market for 40 years and didn't care about men's opinions. Takemikazuki's eyes took that in too. Across the plaza, Hane's chalk broke. She switched to a brush she'd tucked in her sleeve, ink-thick and impatient. Kana bent over the chisel and hammered in AR. Rhythm that would have looked like madness if you didn't understand mathematics. Rukia had started to sweat between shoulder blades. Yoruichi had a seal in her teeth and another under her heel and was humming just to irritate the curtain. The fourth seal broke when Kana found the petty stroke, the flourish someone had added for pride. She chipped it, almost dainty. The curtain shivered, angry in a way that had nothing of God in it and everything of men. Takemikazuki stopped mid-cut and turned his head, the kind of turn predators make when they sense the direction of a bigger predator. Far, far above the roofs. The silence curtain tightened, compressed, and descended. Swords would not answer. Names would not gather. The room of the world had decided to humiliate them into stillness. Naruto didn't think. He refused to. He chose. Bankai, he said, and the word didn't make sound. The world heard it anyway. The storm fox tore out of him, huge enough to wear the curtain like a shawl and disrespect it. Ink seals raced across his armor, hot as brush just lifted from a stone. The wind rose without noise, which was worse to behold and better to use. It grabbed Takemikazuki, the seal, the lantern's light, the city's scattered embers, and asked them all to hold. It wanted to sever. He held it by the collar. No names, Naruto told it, calm, the way you tell a friend not to kick the door. Because the lock is old and you know how to coax it. Shijima arrived, not with a shape, with subtraction so complete matter had to get out of the way to make room. The god of unwords spread over the plaza until the shadow of it cooled the back of Naruto's neck. The curtain was its skin. The silence was its breath. The void shrine did not come. It remembered him and he came here to meet that memory. The first thing Shijima did was eat the word sword from everyone's hands. The second was try to eat Naruto. He felt his name pulled like taffy, the syllables he had carried from one life to the next. Chi tugged out to see if they wanted to go. One was missing already. Given, and the god found the absence, tasted it, and smiled in a way that required no mouth. Naruto did not scream. He did not vow over the top of the moment to perform bravery. He said the thing Shijima could not have. Oki, he murmured, not the true name of his blade, not the public one either. The nickname Hane had tossed across. A training mat a week ago when his calligraphy had run uglier than usual and she'd grinned, big fox, Too many curls. A private name, born of a joke, love nested inside it by use. The storm fox answered like a dog hearing home. Shijima's attention slid off the nickname like knives off good lacquer. You can't take what was never catalogued and never bowed to a desk. The Bankai held tight. Naruto laughed out of pure, stupid relief and then went forward because he didn't have any other direction. Inside the silence, the duel was not with Takemikazuki anymore. It wasn't even a duel. It was a negotiation conducted in athletics and breath. Shijima pressed forget at the joints of things. The hinge in Naruto's left knee, the notch at his wrist where a cut was trying to choose scar, the soft place at the back of his tongue where words stop being nouns and start being bridges. He refused forget. He wrote remember with his shoulder into the god's fabric, not by grunting or cursing or praying. By moving like everything in him had a name and could say itself. He lifted the lantern with both hands and held it in the space Shijima thought was his alone. He did not threaten the god with it. He gave. Here, he breathed, even though breath didn't help. You want names. Here. The lantern flared. Not bright. True. Its panes turned warm. Its plates pushed out light the way a tired woman puss. He's out a loaf of bread she promised to bake before daylight. The glow settled onto chalk rails, onto Azane's hands, onto Yoruichi's grin, onto Rukia's ice. It ran down alley walls where children had ridden this way with stolen coal. It lit the corners of mattresses where bodies had huddled because the city had forgotten how to call itself to wake. Naruto found Kana's map in his head, the constellations of embers, and chose a path through them as if playing fingers across a stringed instrument with ridiculous confidence. He refused to take names from Shijima. He returned them to people. Ma. N in Ward 3 held his wife's face and said aoi with all the vowels and none of the shame. A girl sat up in Ward 9 and remembered that her mother called her pudding when she'd been sweet and dump. Ling when she hadn't. Both were good names. A captain 3 districts over reached for his Zanpakuto and it wasn't there, because swords are shy around gods. His vice captain said hey with a whack to T. He ribs and the word dropped a line down to him and he hauled himself up it. That counted. The god tried, one more time, to barter. It pressed a cool palm to Naruto's mouth and offered him a victory clean cuts and tidy losses if he would just stop being messy with his love. He didn't. I won't trade their names for anything, he said into that palm. He didn't beg the weather to make that sentence true. He made it true and the wind signed with a flourish. Takemikazuki appeared at his right shoulder like an admission. He looked at the seal still trying to cling to the plaza's dirt and, without changing expression, cut the control sigil above it, the ash-gray knot of covenanted marks that had been telling the curtain where to wait itself. He didn't strike at Shijima. He struck at men. Seal splintered with bureaucratic resentment. The curtain sagged. Takemikazuki flicked goreless dust from his blade and stepped to Naruto's side at a careful distance, not friend and not enemy, something more useful. You make a poor tyrant, he said, tone flat. Not applying, Naruto said, and lifted the lantern higher. Shijima was not a thing you beat. It was a weather pattern you convinced to break over ocean instead of city. As the curtain thinned, it pressed itself into bodies trying to survive. It failed to recognize those bodies had people inside them willing to be irresponsible with their love. On the east wall, men in Central 46 robes tried to reassert the math. Their seal bearers flung fresh strokes onto stone. Kana vaulted a cart like a violent librarian, grabbed one of them by the collar, and dragged him in front of the lantern. Tell the nice room what you did, she mouthed. He tried not to. The lantern held up a mirror to his seal and it looked back uglier than it had inside his head. He broke like cheap chalk. Rukia and 3 officers marched the rest of the attendants out with that quiet dignity that makes collapses look like policy. Yoruichi found the worst of the knives and broke them in 2 and put the halves in 2 different pockets so they couldn't find each other again. Azane moved through bodies like a rumor of relief. Hane wrote a line across the ga. Tay and people stood behind it and didn't cross because someone they trusted had put chalk there. Naruto stood in the plaza, lantern heavy in his arms. Benkai's armor worn thin where vows had rubbed. He waited to feel the moment when Shijima decided to be less when absence turned back into the normal lack we forgive in every room. When it came not like a victory cheer. It came like breathing. A sparrow landed on a sign and sang a note so stupid and beautiful that 4 grown men cried because it made their throats remember the muscle. The curtain lifted. Swords answered hands. Not all at once. Some would take coaxing, but the weight had changed. Shijima retreated without turning. Gods don't sulk. It didn't even plan. It learned. Naruto let the Bankai fold down, inch by inch, treating it like a beast that needed thanks to remember not to bite friend next time. Armor fell away. He kept the lantern to his chest a moment more and felt, in the warm metal, the hollow where his lost syllable lived now. A little altar where he had put it on purpose. Takemikazuki lowered his blade. He looked at the broken seal, at Kana's face, at Rukia and Yoruichi and Azane and Hane, at Naruto's hands. The breath he took had a shape like resignation. Their order is over, he said. They will make another. He put the blade away with precision that had nothing to do with ritual and everything to do with respect for tools. Do not ask me to join you. I won't, Naruto said. I'll expect you to think before you obey. Takemikazuki's mouth tilted. Not a smile, not. He turned and walked into the brightening morning with the unhurried ease of a man who intends to live until he is interrupted. The arrests were ugly and boring, which is the best a decent city can hope for in a hurry. Kia made sure the forms were real and that the men who signed them understood they were signing about people, not furniture. Kana gave testimony by dangling a forged seal from a string and smashing it with a hammer. Yoruichi stole 3 sets of keys and threw them off 3 different bridges because it amused her. Azane bandaged friend and enemy with equal impatience and exact compassion. Someone tried to thank her and she glared him into drinking water. Naruto took the lantern to the training hall and set it on the floor where yesterday a different desperate thing had been done. Hane brushed chalk dust off her palms in quick strokes and sat with her back against a pillar like a soldier at ease. They didn't look at each other immediately. They didn't need to. The room had learned their weight. Cost tally, she said finally. So practical it counted as mercy. Some, he said. Not all. Enough. She rolled the cheap festival coin over her knuckles. It clicked once as metal does when bent and rebent. She flipped it to him. He caught it and felt the dent her grip had left. He put it in his sleeve. He'd return it when he could lie about being less sentimental. What did you give it? She asked, looking at the lantern. A piece I can live without badly, he said. He didn't specify. He didn't need to. Her eyes flicked to the side at the exact moment anyone else might say Naruto. She stumbled over nothing and gave him a long, flat stare that wasn't unkind. Stupid, she said. Correct, he said. She stood and bumped her shoulder into his as if to test the integrity of something invisible. You talked to it with my nickname for your sword, she said, deadpan. He blinked once. You saw. I'm not blind, she said. I also have excellent taste. It worked, he said. Obviously, she said. My nicknames always do. He laughed short, then shook out the haori and hung it on the peg as if putting away a well-used tool. He left it crooked. He liked it that way. Hane watched the gesture and didn't correct it, which was her being generous. Outside, the city started to sound like itself again. Not loud. Loud would come later when the story had to be told a dozen times over soup. For now it was footsteps and the soft noise of cloth and the first shy laugh peeking around a corner to see if it would be allowed. Naruto walked a wall at sunset with a woman who drew maps and an antique humming in his pocket. The light made their shadows long and their jobs look simple. He glanced sideways, then ahead, then said a thing that didn't need dramatic weight to be weight. Walk with me when the wind's stupid and loud, he said, like a joke tossed between shifts. Hane bumped him again, hip to hip, not romantic because that makes people self-conscious, intimate because that makes people human. That's most days, she said. Try not to ask the wind to be quiet too long. It gets offended. I've noticed, he said. She stopped and flicked him a look that unspooled a laugh he hadn't had time for. Also, she said, sign the forms next time. Yes, Lieutenant. I'm keeping you alive to irritate you, she said. Mutual, he said. On a different wall, Rukia oversaw lines of off. Isers writing what had happened while it was still close enough to mention without myth. She didn't claim power. She claimed record, which is a kinder thing. Yoruichi sat on a gate and ate a plum with all the smugness of a truth that could have been a lie if anyone else told it. Azane threw 2 men out of her clinic for flirting in chairs needed for the wounded, then let them sit on the floor and flirt there where it cost less. Kana, exhausted beyond reason, fell asleep at her bench and, 20 minutes later, woke with a piece of equipment sketched under her cheek in drool and brilliance, swore at herself, and immediately built it. Naruto went back to the training hall when the sky had darkened to comfortable. He set the lantern on his palm and turned it until the hum lined up with his pulse. It would be both tool and burden for a while. He'd keep it small. He'd keep his division small too. He had no business running an empire. He had exactly the right business to make sure markets could remember their noise. Shunsui came like a chair creaking, like the pleasant sound of a drink poured. He leaned in the doorway and watched Naruto look at the lantern without feeling the need to speak first. "I'm not making a new rule," Naruto said before the man could. "I'm keeping one old." "Which one is that?" Shunsui asked, amused and tired. "Don't let them vanish," Naruto said. He paused. "If I act like a rule, hit me with your hat." Shunsui considered his hat. "That would be sacrilege," he said. "But I'll think of something." He went serious in the efficient way he keeps for when the room needs it. "There will be hearings. Rukia will shine," Naruto said. "And you?" "I'll be busy," he said. "Walls, mostly. Repairs. The kind you do with people." Shunsui nodded, almost a bow. "You make a poor tyrant," he said, echoing another man from earlier, and his mouth softened. "We've been short on those." When the captain commander had gone, quiet dropped in a friendly way. Naruto set the lantern down and let his hands hang at his sides. He stretched shoulders and winced at the places Takemikazuki's blade had insisted it had to be counted. He would be sore. He would be fine. The city would be sore. It would be fine. He lay back on the floorboards and stared at the beams until his eyes fuzzed. He did not pray. He might have said thanks to a handful of mundane objects, to the coin in his sleeve, to the chalk stump in his pocket, to the wind under the door. The wind did as asked and stayed. It likes being told what to do when it's given a good reason. Later, Hane would sit on the same floor with her back to a pillar. Long legs slanted out, and tow the lantern lazily until it hummed exactly in time with the metronome in Azane's kit. Later, Yoruichi would swing through the window, steal the cheapest teacup in reach, and make them drink something that was definitely not tea. Later, Rukia would drop a copy of a form in his lap and say, "Sign this," and he would write his name. And stumble a little, and they would not speak about how someone somewhere would keep stumbling over the new shape of it. Not tonight. Tonight, sleep counted as work. He closed his eyes and saw chalk on stone. He saw a boy in a laundromat clutching a name in his mouth like candy. He saw the god's hand fail to close around a nickname said with a smile. "You can keep trying," he told the ceiling, "WH." It was fair proxy for shrines and corridors and anything else listening. "I'll keep returning things." By morning, the markets would sound like themselves again. The ninth seat would tell an embellished story in 3 taverns. Central 46 would argue itself hoarse and forget horse as a sound. Division 14 would have fewer chairs than people. They would sit on the floor and carve instructions into bread crusts between bites, because that's when you remember what matters. Beyond the walls and the clean papers and the places men pretend are all that matter, the Dongai carried its currents like a spine. In one eddy where old time and new time forgot whether to shake hands, a silence kernel the size of a cherry pit bobbed. It had learned something today. It didn't plan. It remembered. It remembered exactly one syllable of a captain's name. It would try to return it someday, perhaps by accident, perhaps because some gods and some winds cannot resist a punchline. Naruto slept with chalk under his hand and his haori crooked on its peg, and the wind convinced that staying is a kind of motion. He had not traded anyone's name for victory. He had made the city say itself out loud and mean it. Tomorrow, there would be walls to mend and ledgers to tear and people to nudge toward doors. He would write "Don't let anyone be alone" on more stones than a formalist would permit. He would be exhausting. He would be loved for it, and occasionally asked to shut up. He smiled as sleep took him, a small expression the dark knew how to keep. Chapter 5 End.